Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to hold in your hand a single drop of blood and know, with quiet certainty, that something within it remains unexplained? That after decades of modern science, after centuries of careful observation, after millennia of human beings watching one another live and die and pass their features to their children, there is still a question written inside the human body that no one has fully answered? Have you ever considered that somewhere in the quiet architecture of your own cells, there may be a code whose origin points not to the familiar paths of human evolution, but to something older, something less mapped, something that the ancient world may have understood in ways we're only beginning to approach again? If you enjoy these quiet journeys through history and mystery, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, only if it genuinely brings you something peaceful and worthwhile. And if you feel like it, leave a comment below with where you are in the world tonight and what time it is as you listen. It is always a comfort to know that voices from so many different places gather here together in the dark. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. Let the room settle around you. Perhaps turn on a small fan for that gentle, steady hum that carries the mind towards stillness. Breathe slowly and let your body grow heavy and easy against whatever surface holds you tonight. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins not in a laboratory and not in a library, but in the oldest place a human story can begin, in the blood itself, moving through living bodies, carrying something forward through time that the people who carried it could not have named but somehow, in their deepest instincts, seemed to sense. Long before any scientist gave a name to blood type, long before any physician understood transfusion or immunity, or the invisible proteins that coat the surface of a red blood cell, human beings across every continent had already arrived at the same wordless conclusion, that blood was not simply a liquid. It was not merely the red tide that spilled from wounds and announced the presence of life. Blood was meaning. Blood was lineage. Blood was the thread that ran between a living person and every ancestor who'd ever walked the same soil, spoken the same language, offered the same prayers to the same sky. To understand why the mystery of negative blood holds such a powerful grip on the human imagination, you must first understand how ancient the fascination with blood truly is, and how deeply the idea of a special or divine bloodline runs through almost every civilization that has left a record of its beliefs. Consider the landscape of the ancient world as it existed in the centuries before writing, before cities, before the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually become science. Across the open grasslands of what is now Central Asia, across the dense forests of what would become Europe, across the river valleys of the Near East, where the first permanent settlements were beginning to take shape, human beings lived in small, close communities held together by kinship. The bonds of family were not abstract or sentimental. They were practical and immediate. You survived because of your kin. You ate because of your kin. You were defended, sheltered, taught, and buried by your kin. And so the question of whose blood you carried, who your mother was, who your father was, how far back your lineage could be traced, was not a matter of idle curiosity. It was a matter of life and death, of belonging and exclusion, of identity at its most fundamental level. In those early communities, the people who possessed certain qualities, unusual height, remarkable memory, an ability to heal, a gift for reading weather or predicting seasons, a calm that held steady when others fell into panic, were watched carefully. Their children were watched even more carefully. And over many generations, a quiet understanding began to form, that certain qualities ran in certain families, that something in the blood of a particular lineage carried something that other lineages did not. This was not science, it was observation, long and careful and repeated across so many generations that it hardened into belief, and belief hardened into ritual, and ritual hardened into the sacred structures of early civilization. Picture a village at the edge of a wide river delta, perhaps 12,000 years ago, in the slow-warming centuries after the last great ice had retreated from the northern lands. The houses are low and round, built from mud and river reed, roofed with dried grass that rustles softly in the evening wind. The smell of cooking fire drifts through the settlement, and somewhere near the river's edge, a woman is grinding grain against a flat stone, the rhythmic scrape of her work carrying through the still air. She's not thinking about blood in any abstract sense. She's thinking about her daughter, who was born with eyes of an unusual pale colour and who has been noticed by the village elder for the quality of her gaze, the way it seems to rest on things at a slight distance from the ordinary world. The elder has said something about the girl's people, about where her family came from, about a long walk from the north many generations ago. He has not explained everything, but his voice carries a particular weight when he speaks of these things, and the woman at the grinding stone has learned over many years to listen to that weight. This scene, or something very much like it, was repeated across thousands of settlements in thousands of variations over countless generations. The precise details shift with latitude and climate and culture, but the underlying structure remains remarkably consistent. Certain families, certain lineages, certain carriers of particular physical or temperamental traits were set apart, quietly or formally, from the general community. They were given roles as healers, as priests, as advisors to leaders, as keepers of the old stories. In some cultures they were elevated to near-divine status. In others they were simply treated with a particular kind of deference, a recognition that something in their inheritance was not quite the same as the inheritance of others. The blood shed in birth was watched. The blood shed in ritual sacrifice was read for signs. The blood of kings was held to be categorically different from the blood of farmers, not merely in the social sense, but in what was believed to be a literal, physical, almost metaphysical sense. When the ancient Egyptians spoke of the divine blood of the pharaoh, when the Mesopotamian kings described themselves as the children of the gods, when the early Hebrew texts spoke of lineages that carried special covenants with the divine, they were not speaking purely in metaphor. There was, embedded in these beliefs, a genuine and earnest conviction that blood carried something real, something transmissible, something that could be born into a child and recognized in the way that child grew, thought, and moved through the world. The River Nile, which will appear many times in this story, was already ancient when the first pharaohs rose to power. It had been flowing for millions of years before the first human hand cupped its water, and its flooding cycles had already shaped the ecology and the agriculture and the very imaginative life of the people who lived along its banks, long before anyone thought to write anything down. The Egyptian year turned on the rhythm of the Nile's flood, the inundation that came each summer, depositing the rich black silt that made the valley one of the most fertile strips of land on Earth. Life in the Nile Valley was not easy, but it was organised, and it was organised around a principle that would carry forward into every subsequent Egyptian dynasty. The principle that the land itself was sacred, and that the one who ruled the land stood at the intersection of the human and the divine. To the east, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, a similar set of ideas was taking shape, but in a somewhat different form. The Sumerians, who built the first cities the world had ever seen, organised their society around the ziggurat, the great stepped tower that rose from the flat alluvial plain like an artificial mountain, a built bridge between the earth and the sky. At the top of the ziggurat lived, symbolically at least, the god of the city, and the king of the city was understood to be that god's representative on earth. Not quite divine himself, but touched by divinity, marked by it, chosen by it. The rituals that confirmed this status were elaborate and ancient, and they involved blood in ways that the surviving texts describe only partially, as if the full meaning was too sacred or too dangerous to set down completely. In the cold uplands to the north and west, in the regions that would much later become Europe, the situation was less urbanized but no less spiritually charged. The megalithic builders, those who raised the great stone monuments at Karnak and Avebury, and dozens of other sites across what is now France and Britain and Ireland, left almost no written record. What they left instead was stone, enormous and patient and silent. And the arrangement of those stones, aligned with such precision to the movements of the sun and moon and certain stars, tells us that these people were observers of a very high order, that they had developed over many generations a sophisticated understanding of the sky and its cycles, and that this understanding was held by certain people within the community, people whose role was defined by knowledge, and whose knowledge was, in some sense, inherited. Among the descendants of these stone builders, among the Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples of the Atlantic coast of Europe, there existed a concentration of something that the modern world would not identify or name until the middle of the 20th century. A quality of blood, a specific antigen, or rather a specific absence of an antigen, that set certain people apart from the great majority of the human population in a way that was entirely invisible to the naked eye, entirely undetectable by the methods of ancient medicine, and yet somehow, in the accumulated wisdom of generations of careful watchers, perhaps not entirely unknown. The Basque people, who have lived in the region between what is now northern Spain and southwestern France since before recorded history, carry this quality in higher concentrations than almost any other population on Earth. Their language, which they call Euskara, is one of the great mysteries of European linguistics. It is not related to any other language on the continent. It is not Indo-European, not Semitic, not related to any of the language families that can be traced to known migrations or invasions. It stands alone, a linguistic island in a sea of related tongues, as if it were not brought to that region by any known wave of migration, but was simply already there, already formed when the rest of the languages arrived around it. And the Basque people carry, in numbers that have drawn the attention of scientists and historians and theorists alike, a remarkably high proportion of negative blood. This is where the modern story of negative blood begins, though the deeper story reaches much further back than any laboratory or any census. It begins with blood, as so many human stories do. It begins with the question of what blood carries and what it means, and whether the answer to that question might reach all the way back to the very origins of the human story, or perhaps even further than that. The dry season in the ancient Near East was a time of waiting. The fields, which had been green and productive through the cooler months, turned brown and brittle under the climbing sun, and the animals moved to whatever shade they could find. The people moved more slowly, conserving water and energy, gathering in the deeper shade of mud brick houses whose thick walls held the relative coolness of the night through many hours of the blazing afternoon. In that stillness, in that enforced quiet of the hot season, there was time to talk, time to remember, time to repeat the old stories. And the old stories, in almost every culture of the ancient Near East, circled back eventually to the same themes. The gods who had come down from the sky, the mixing of divine and human blood, the creation of a special lineage that carried the mark of that mixing forward through the centuries. These stories were not invented lightly. They were not entertainment in any casual sense. They were the most serious and carefully preserved knowledge a community possessed, because they explained the most important things, where human beings had come from, what they were for, who among them was set apart by divine favour, and what obligations that favour placed on both the set-apart ones and those who recognised them. The stories were repeated at festivals, at the New Year, at the planting and the harvest, at births and deaths and the transitions of power. They were held in the memory of the priests and the singers and the elders, passed from one generation to the next with the same care that a farmer passes seed, because the quality of what is passed determines the quality of what grows. As you rest tonight, let these images settle around you like warm air. The flat horizon of a Mesopotamian plain in early evening, the smoke rising from 100 small fires, the first stars appearing in a sky still pale at the edge with the last light of the sun. Somewhere in that landscape, in one of those mud brick houses or in the courtyard of a temple, someone is repeating a story about blood, about where it came from, about what it carries, about the invisible thread that runs between the living and the divine, and somewhere in that story, waiting quietly in the language like a seed in dry ground, is the question that we are following tonight. One patient step at a time. The land that held these early peoples was, in many ways, defined by its rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates in the east, the Nile in the west, the Indus further to the east still. These were the organising principles of ancient civilization, the spines around which everything grew. But there were other waters too, less celebrated in history, but no less important to the people who depended on them. The rivers of the Caucasus Mountains, flowing down from the high, rocky spine of that range into the flatlands below. The springs and streams of the Zagros foothills, the seasonal rivers of the Levantine coast that ran swift and cold in winter, and slow to a trickle or nothing in the dry months. All of these waters carried people with them, along their courses and away from them, mixing populations and separating them, creating the complex layered pattern of human genetic diversity that a modern scientist can read in a blood sample, the way a geologist reads strata in a cliff face. The people of the Caucasus region have also attracted attention in discussions of oronegative blood distribution. The ancient populations of what is now Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan lived at the crossroads of massive migration routes, in a landscape that combined high mountain passes with relatively accessible valleys, and their genetic heritage reflects that position, a mixing of influences from east and west, north and south, that produced populations of remarkable diversity. Among them, certain groups carried and still carry elevated rates of negative blood, a fact that has not gone unnoticed by those who study either the genetics or the mythology of the ancient world. The mountains themselves shaped the people who lived among them in ways that the plains and river valleys did not. Mountain communities, isolated by terrain and weather for months at a time, preserved old ways that the more connected lowland cities lost to the constant churn of trade and conquest and cultural mixing. The blood of those mountain communities, too, was preserved in a different way, passed down within relatively closed populations that did not intermarry with the wider world to the same degree that the merchants of a riverport city would have. And so, in those high, cold places where the wind came clean and sharp off ancient stone, something old was quietly kept. The evenings in those mountains were long and deeply dark, lit only by fire and stars, and the stories told around those fires were, by necessity, the same stories that had been told for generations before. No writing to preserve them, no temple scribes to codify them, only the human voice and human memory and the absolute necessity of keeping the knowledge alive. In those stories, as in the stories of the lowland civilizations, the blood was always important. The blood was always the carrier. The blood was always the thread. A generation passed in that ancient world, and then another, and the patterns deepened. The people who carried certain qualities in their blood continued to be set apart, continued to be watched, continued to be given, or to assume the roles that stood between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it. And somewhere in that long, quiet accumulation of observation and belief and practice, the mystery of Rho-negative blood was being written, not in any text that has survived, not in any language that any living scholar can read, but in the bodies of the people who carried it, passing it forward through time the way a river carries a particular mineral, dissolved and invisible, all the way from the mountain where it was born to the sea where it finally rests. The story of that blood, and what it may mean, is a long one. It winds through the corridors of ancient temples and the counting rooms of early scientists, through the sacred texts of multiple traditions and the sequencing machines of modern genetics laboratories. It touches some of the most enduring questions that human beings have ever asked about themselves: where we came from, what we are, and whether there is something in us, something written in the very chemistry of our cells, that connects us to a past more strange and more wonderful than the ordinary history of evolution and migration might suggest. And that story, told quietly and carefully and without haste, is what we have come to explore tonight, in the soft dark, with the fan turning and the breath slowing, and the world outside growing still. Rest easy now, as the first threads of the mystery begin to take their shape. Years passed, then millennia. The blood kept its secret, moving through the generations, waiting for the moment when the tools existed to ask the right questions. That moment came, though slowly, and in ways that no one fully expected. The world into which modern blood science was born was a world already saturated with questions about human difference. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of intense, sometimes obsessive attention to the biological basis of human variation, an attention that produced both genuine scientific insight and some of the most catastrophic errors in the history of human thought. It was in this charged and complicated atmosphere that the first real steps toward understanding what blood actually carries were taken, and the man who took the most consequential of those steps was an Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner. Landsteiner was working in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, in a city that was at that moment one of the intellectual capitals of the world. The coffee houses were full of argument, the universities were producing ideas that would reshape philosophy and psychology and physics, and in the medical laboratories, a quiet revolution in the understanding of the human body was underway. Landsteiner was methodical, patient, and possessed of the kind of careful attention to anomaly that marks the best scientific minds in any era. He noticed something that others had observed, but not yet systematically studied, that when blood from one person was mixed with blood from another, the results were sometimes perfectly benign, and sometimes catastrophically destructive, producing clumping and rupture that could kill a patient who had survived the surgery that made the transfusion necessary. This phenomenon had been observed for centuries. Attempts at blood transfusion go back at least to the 17th century, and the results were so unpredictable, so often fatal, that the practice had been banned in several countries. But no one had understood why. Landsteiner, working with careful and systematic patients, mixing blood samples and observing the reactions, eventually arrived at the conclusion that would earn him the Nobel Prize in 1930, that human blood could be divided into distinct types, defined by the presence or absence of specific antigens on the surface of the red blood cells, and that a transfusion would be safe only if the donors' and recipients' blood types were compatible. He identified the three initial types that he called A, B, and O. A fourth type, AB, was identified shortly afterward by two of his colleagues. This was the ABO blood group system, the first systematic classification of human blood, and it changed medicine immediately and permanently. For the first time, blood transfusions could be performed with a reasonable expectation of safety. For the first time, physicians understood that the human population was divided, invisibly but meaningfully, into groups defined by what their blood carried. But the ABO system was only the beginning. There were other antigens, other proteins, other molecular features of blood that Landsteiner and subsequent researchers were only beginning to map. And one of these, identified in 1937 and confirmed in the early 1940s, would prove to be particularly puzzling, not because of what it was exactly, but because of what it revealed about the distribution of certain genetic traits across the human population. The ARC factor, named initially after the rhesus monkey, in whose blood a similar antigen had been identified during early experiments, is defined by the presence or absence of a specific protein on the surface of red blood cells. Those who carry this protein are Rh positive, those who do not carry it are Rh negative. The distinction matters enormously in medicine, most critically in the case of pregnancy, where a Rh negative mother carrying a Rh positive child can develop antibodies against the child's blood, a condition known as hemolytic disease of the newborn, which before modern medicine developed treatments for it, was often fatal to the child and sometimes to the mother as well. This medical reality introduced the first layer of genuine biological strangeness into the Rh negative story. In evolutionary terms, a genetic trait that kills offspring should not persist in a population. Natural selection, the engine that drives the change in living species over time, works by favouring traits that allow their carriers to survive and reproduce, and by quietly eliminating traits that reduce survival or reproductive success. A blood type that, when mixed with the more common Rh positive type, produces a reaction that endangers the life of infants should, over enough generations, become vanishingly rare. And yet it has not. The R negative trait persists in the human population in significant numbers, comprising roughly 15% of people of European descent, with higher concentrations in specific populations and lower but still present concentrations in populations around the world. Why? That is the question that has occupied scientists, historians, mythologists, and countless curious and careful thinkers since the Rh factor was first identified. Why does this blood type persist? What does its persistence mean? And where, in the long story of human beings moving across the earth and mixing their bloodlines in every possible combination, did it come from in the first place? The night is soft around you now, and the questions are settling into the room like the particular quality of stillness that comes after the last sounds of the day have faded. Let them rest there, those questions, as we move deeper into the history of blood and meaning, following the thread of the mystery one careful step at a time. The geography of Rh negative blood distribution is one of the most striking features of the mystery, and it is worth dwelling on at some length, because the pattern that emerges when you map the frequency of Rh negative blood across the world's populations is not a random scatter. It is a shape, and the shape has meaning, or at least it has the quality of meaning, that peculiar sense that a pattern is pointing at something, even if what it is pointing at remains just beyond the reach of current understanding. The highest concentrations of Rh negative blood in the world are found among the Basque people of the border region between Spain and France. Estimates vary, but studies have consistently shown that somewhere between 30 and 40% of Basques carry Rh negative blood, a figure that is roughly double or more the rate found in most European populations, and many times higher than the rates found in populations of East Asian, African, or indigenous American descent. This extraordinary concentration in a single population that has already attracted attention for its linguistic isolation and its unusual genetic profile is one of the central puzzles of the negative story. From the Basque country, the frequency of negative blood falls away as you move outward in almost every direction, but not uniformly. It remains relatively high across much of Western and Northern Europe, among the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, the Basque-adjacent populations of northern Spain and southwestern France, and to a somewhat lesser degree across the rest of the British Isles and the Atlantic coast of the European continent. It is found in somewhat lower but still notable concentrations among populations of the Middle East and North Africa, particularly among the Berber peoples of the Maghreb, the coastal and highland peoples of what is now Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, who have long fascinated anthropologists for their own unusual combination of physical and genetic traits. Moving eastward across Asia, the frequency of Os-negative blood drops considerably. Among populations of East Asian descent, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, rates are typically 1 or 2% or less. Among the populations of sub-Saharan Africa and the indigenous populations of the Americas and Australia, rates are similarly low, sometimes approaching 0 in isolated or long-established groups. This pattern, high in the west, particularly in the far western edge of Europe and in certain North African populations, lower as you move east, very low in the populations most geographically remote from Europe, is not what you would expect if the negative trait had arisen many times independently across the human species. It looks more like the signature of a single origin point, or perhaps a small number of origin points, from which the trait spread outward with the movement of specific populations. It looks, in other words, like a bloodline. The word bloodline carries weight in this story that goes far beyond the merely genetic. In every culture that has left a record, the concept of a distinct bloodline, a lineage defined not merely by descent but by something special that the descent carried, is one of the most persistent and serious ideas in human thought. The pharaohs of Egypt maintained their bloodlines through careful marriage practices, sometimes including within the royal family itself, specifically to preserve whatever it was that the blood of the divine king carried. The priestly castes of ancient India, the Brahmin families who guarded the Vedic knowledge, married within their caste for the same reason, to preserve in the blood something that could not be preserved any other way. The royal houses of ancient Mesopotamia kept genealogies going back, in their own accounting, to the time before the flood, to the period when, according to the Sumerian king lists, kings had reigned for tens of thousands of years, which the ancient compilers attributed without apparent irony or embarrassment to the divine quality of the blood those early kings carried. These are not coincidences. They are not independent inventions of the same idea. They are reflections of something very old in human experience, a recognition that whatever is carried in the blood, in the literal physical blood as well as in the metaphorical or spiritual sense, is real and transmissible and worth preserving. Whether that recognition was based on the kind of direct observation that eventually became science, or on something more intuitive and less easily categorized, the consistency of the belief across such widely separated cultures and time periods is itself a form of evidence. Evidence of what exactly remains the question. Let the room grow quiet around you now. The fan turns, the breath slows, and the ancient world settles into its familiar darkness, waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. There is no hurry. The mystery has waited thousands of years to be told. It can wait a few more moments while you settle deeper into the night. The morning light in the ancient Basque country comes slowly, pushing over the shoulders of the Pyrenean peaks in long, pale shafts that catch the mist rising from the valleys below. The oak forests that cover the lower slopes hold the darkness a little longer than the open ground, and in that lingering shadow, the villages come to life with the sounds that have defined morning in that region, for longer than anyone can calculate with certainty. The low voices of people moving through familiar routines, the smell of wood smoke, the soft percussion of animals being led to pasture, the distant sound of water running over stone in one of the many small streams that cut through the hills on their way to the Bay of Biscay. The Basque people, the Euskaldunak as they call themselves in their own ancient tongue, have lived in this landscape for a very long time. How long is one of the questions that continues to occupy historians and geneticists and linguists in equal measure, because the answer, depending on which line of evidence you follow, ranges from the merely ancient to the almost incomprehensibly old. Their language, Euskara, which shows no demonstrable relationship to any other language on Earth, was already established in this region when the Indo-European speaking peoples, the ancestors of the modern Spanish, French, and most other European populations, began to move into Western Europe in the millennia before the Common Era. The Basques, in other words, were already there. They were there before the Celts, before the Romans, before the waves of migration that produced the genetic and linguistic landscape of modern Europe as we know it. They were, in a very real sense, the last surviving representatives of an older Europe, a pre-Indo-European Europe, whose other languages and peoples were absorbed or displaced by the long tide of migration from the East. The genetic evidence supports this picture in broad terms. Studies of Basque DNA have consistently shown that this population carries a genetic profile that is distinctly different from that of their neighbours, with characteristics that suggest a very long period of relative isolation and a deep continuity with the populations of Upper Paleolithic Europe. The people who painted the extraordinary cave paintings at Altamira and Lascaux, who lived in Western Europe during and after the last Ice Age, and who represent the oldest continuously documented human presence in the region. The blood type distribution of the Basques, with its extraordinary concentration of Rh negative carriers, fits this picture of ancient origin and long isolation. Whatever the source of the Rh negative trait, it appears to have been present in the ancestral Basque population for a very long time, preserved through the same relative isolation that preserved the language and the distinctive genetic profile. But the Basques are not alone in this. As you move along the Atlantic coast of Europe, from the Bay of Biscay northward through the coasts of Brittany and northwestern France, across the water to Ireland and Scotland and Wales, you encounter a cluster of populations that share certain features, a higher than average frequency of Rh negative blood, a set of pre-Christian traditions that resist easy classification within the Indo-European religious framework, and a connection to the megalithic monuments that dot this coastline like a chain of stone memories from a world before writing. The people of Brittany, the Irish, the Scots of the Western Highlands and Islands, the Welsh of the mountains, all of these populations carry, in different degrees, a genetic and cultural signature that suggests connection to a very old substrate of European population, the same substrate from which the Basques are the most intact surviving representatives. The megalithic monuments of this Atlantic zone are among the most striking physical achievements of prehistoric humanity. The great stone circles, the passage graves, the standing stones arranged in long avenues across open moorland. These structures required engineering knowledge, organisational capacity, and a sustained communal effort that implies a level of social and intellectual sophistication that the word prehistoric often fails to convey. The people who built them were not the shuffling, dim-witted cave dwellers of popular imagination. They were careful observers of the sky, precise calculators of celestial alignments, skilled organisers of large-scale labour, and the possessors of a cosmological vision complex enough to require permanent stone expressions of its key principles. At Newgrange in Ireland, the great passage tomb built more than 5,000 years ago, the central chamber is aligned with such precision to the rising sun at the winter solstice that on the shortest days of the year, a narrow beam of light penetrates the passage and illuminates the stone chamber at its heart. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated, and technically demanding achievement, built by people who understood the movements of the sky well enough to design a building around a specific astronomical event, and who cared enough about that event to invest the enormous labour required to mark it permanently in stone. The winter solstice sunrise, the moment when the sun's retreat ends and its return begins, when the darkness is at its greatest and the light is about to win, was apparently important enough to these people to justify one of the most impressive construction projects of the ancient world. Who were these builders, and what did they carry in their blood? The ancient DNA recovered from the bones of people buried at Newgrange and similar monuments has confirmed that they were indeed part of the old Atlantic population of Western Europe, the descendants of the first farmers who came to the region from continental Europe around 6,000 years ago, mixing with the earlier hunter-gatherer populations who'd been there since the end of the Ice Age. And among the populations that are most directly descended from these ancient builders, the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots, the Bretons, the frequency of negative blood is elevated above the European average, continuing the pattern that the Basque data most dramatically illustrates. This geographic clustering is interesting in its own right as a scientific observation. But it becomes genuinely extraordinary when you set it beside the mythological and religious traditions of the same populations, because those traditions, the old Irish mythology recorded in medieval manuscripts, the Welsh stories collected in the Mabinogion, the Arthurian cycle with its deep roots in Celtic tradition, the Breton legends of a sunken land beneath the sea, are full of the same themes that run through the ancient Near Eastern texts, the Egyptian religious literature and the Mesopotamian epics. They are full of beings who are partly human and partly something else, of divine blood mixing with mortal blood to produce heroes and kings and healers and seers, of lineages that carry something special and must be preserved and recognised and honoured. The Irish tradition speaks of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who arrived in Ireland in a cloud of mist and brought with them knowledge and power that the inhabitants of the island had not previously known. The Tuatha De Danann were not presented in the old texts as gods in the conventional sense. They were not the creators of the world or the rulers of the cosmos. They were something more specific and in some ways more interesting. They were a people, a race, a bloodline that carried divine or semi-divine qualities. They were taller than ordinary humans, it was said. They were possessed of unusual beauty and unusual intellectual gifts. They knew things that ordinary people did not know, had access to knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. And when they were eventually defeated and driven underground by the subsequent wave of inhabitants, the Milesians, the ancestors of the historical Irish people, they did not disappear entirely. They retreated into the hills and the fairy mounds, into the hidden places of the landscape, and there they continued to exist, continuing to influence the lives of the people above ground, occasionally appearing to particularly sensitive or gifted individuals, occasionally taking human lovers whose children would inherit something of the old blood. You can hear in this story, if you listen carefully, the same structure that appears in the Mesopotamian accounts of the Anunnaki, in the Hebrew book of Genesis with its cryptic mention of the Nephilim and the sons of God who took human wives, in the Egyptian tradition of the divine pharaoh who carried the blood of Ra. In every case, the story is the same at its core. There was a time when something beyond the ordinary human entered the human bloodstream, and the result of that entering was a lineage that carried something different, something that could be passed down through the generations, something that the people who carried it often did not fully understand but could not entirely ignore. Whether these stories are memories, however distorted by time and retelling, of actual events, or whether they are the human mind's way of explaining its own sense that within the variety of human types, there exists a particular kind of person who seems to operate by slightly different rules, is a question that this story does not need to answer definitively. What matters for our purposes is that the stories exist, that they are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no known contact with each other, and that the populations in which these traditions are strongest are, in many cases, the same populations in which the frequency of Ra's negative blood is highest. The morning in the Basque Hills is fully bright now, the mist burned away by the climbing sun, and the valley below is green and sharply defined. A shepherd is moving his small flock along a path that has been worn into the hillside by generations of the same movement, and the sheep's bells make a soft and irregular music against the silence of the hills. He does not know that his blood carries a particular feature that has attracted the attention of scientists and historians and dreamers from all over the world. He knows the path, and the sheep, and the hills, and the particular quality of the light at this hour. That is enough to fill a life, and perhaps it has always been enough for the people of this ancient land to know the things that are immediately around them and to pass what they know carefully to those who come after. A generation later, and several thousand miles to the east, the same question of blood and lineage was being asked in an entirely different idiom. The civilization of ancient Sumer, which flourished in the flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia in the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, was in many ways the most consequential human achievement of its time. The Sumerians invented writing, not as a single brilliant inspiration, but as the slow practical solution to a specific problem, the need to keep records of the complex economic transactions that their urban society generated in quantities too large for memory alone to handle. The earliest Sumerian texts are accounting records, lists of grain and oil and sheep and cloth, the dry inventory of a commercial civilization. But within a few centuries, the same writing system was being used for something far more ambitious, the recording of the myths and stories and cosmological beliefs that formed the intellectual and spiritual core of Sumerian civilization. And in those stories, as to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Descent of Inanna, the Eridu Genesis, there appears, with remarkable consistency and detail, a cosmological framework in which the creation of human beings is not a simple or entirely benevolent act, but a complex event involving the mixing of divine and earthly materials, producing a being that is neither wholly divine nor wholly of the earth, but something in between, carrying within its body the imprint of both origins. The Sumerian accounts of human creation, which predate the Hebrew Genesis by many centuries and share with it a number of structural similarities that scholars have studied extensively, describe the fashioning of the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a divine being. The specific details vary between different versions of the story, but the essential element is consistent. Human beings carry within them something that came from the gods, not the full divine nature, but a component, a trace, a mixture. And in the Sumerian worldview, this mixed nature explains both the capacities of human beings, their ability to think, to create, to understand, to aspire, and their limitations, which are the limitations of everything that is not wholly divine. The Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, are described in these texts as beings of enormous power and presence, who came down from the sky and established themselves in the land of Sumer, building their cities and organizing the land according to their will. The name Anunnaki is sometimes translated as those who came from heaven to earth, though scholars debate the precise meaning and its various forms across different periods of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. What is not debated is the central role these figures play in the Sumerian cosmological narrative, and the way in which the relationship between the Anunnaki and human beings is defined in terms of blood. Divine blood mixed into human clay, producing the hybrid creature that then becomes the ancestor of all subsequent humanity. The question of what to make of these accounts has occupied serious scholarship for generations, and the answers have ranged from the purely metaphorical — these are symbolic stories about the relationship between the human and the divine, not historical records — to the more literal-minded positions of writers like Zechariah Sitchin, whose 20th century interpretations of the Sumerian texts proposed that the Anunnaki were actual extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered the human species from earlier hominids, and that the traces of their intervention can be found in the biology of living human beings. Sitchin's work has been largely rejected by mainstream scholarship, which notes numerous translation errors and interpretive liberties, but his ideas have had enormous popular influence and form one of the main currents in the contemporary mystery around Ak-negative blood. The scholarly consensus, carefully maintained, holds that the Sumerian creation myths are sophisticated theological narratives, not historical records, and that the Anunnaki are theological constructs, not historical persons. But the consensus also acknowledges that these narratives contain genuine insights into the Sumerian understanding of human nature, that human beings are a mixture, that they carry within them qualities that point beyond the merely animal, and that this mixed nature is the source of both their greatness and their suffering. This is not a trivial observation. It is in fact one of the most profound statements about the human condition ever made, and it is made in almost exactly the same form in texts from Egypt, from India, from Greece, from the Hebrew tradition, and from the oral traditions of peoples on every inhabited continent. The walls of the great ziggurat at Ur, if you could stand before them in the early morning light, would rise above you in 3 massive step tiers, each faced with mud brick baked dark and hard in the kilns of the city. The surface of the brick would be warm to the touch even in the early morning, holding the heat of the previous day and the smell of the city below. Fish from the river, smoke from the cooking fires, the heavy animal smell of the livestock pens, the sharp green smell of the barley fields beyond the city wall, would all rise together in the still air and settle around the base of the great tower like an offering. At the top of the ziggurat, where the god of the city was believed to reside when he descended from the sky to visit his earthly domain, the air was different, cleaner, lighter, touched with the smell of the cedar wood and precious oils that were burned there in the god's honour. The priests who climbed those steps each day to perform the rituals of the god's household, feeding the divine statue, clothing it, perfuming it, making offerings of the finest things the city produced, were themselves a special class of people. In Sumerian society, the priesthood was not simply a profession, it was a calling defined by lineage, passed down within certain families that traced their origins back, in some cases, to the establishment of the city itself. The great priests and priestesses of the major Sumerian cities were chosen not only for their piety and their knowledge of the rituals, but for their blood, for the family they came from, for the lineage they represented, for whatever it was that a particular family was understood to carry that made them more suitable than others to stand in the presence of the divine. This principle, that certain lineages are more closely connected to the divine than others, and that this connection is carried in the blood and passed through descent, is one that appears in virtually every ancient civilization that has left a sufficiently detailed record of its beliefs. In Egypt, the pharaoh's divine blood was the theological cornerstone of the entire political and religious system. In ancient China, the emperor ruled by virtue of the mandate of heaven, which was itself a kind of divine authorization carried in the imperial bloodline. In ancient India, the Brahmin caste derived its authority not from individual achievement, but from the accumulated spiritual merit and divine connection of the lineage from which its members descended. In ancient Israel, the priesthood was restricted to the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, a restriction based entirely on lineage, on blood, on the principle that something carried in that particular family's descent made them appropriate for a role that no amount of personal virtue could qualify a man for if he was not of the right blood. These are not primitive superstitions. They are sophisticated expressions of a deeply held conviction about the relationship between ancestry, blood, and spiritual capacity, and they are consistent across cultures that had very limited or no contact with each other, which suggests that the conviction is not merely cultural, not merely a story that spread from one place to another, but something that arose independently in multiple places because it reflected a genuine observation about human variation that the cultures in question had made separately and arrived at the same conclusion about. What was that observation? That is the heart of the mystery. And as we move deeper into the ancient world, following the thread of blood and lineage through the corridors of its great civilizations, the outlines of an answer begin to emerge, however tentatively, from the darkness. The Nile Valley in the season of the inundation was a world transformed. The great river, swollen with the rain and snowmelt of equatorial Africa, rose from its banks and spread across the flat land on either side in a shallow sheet of brown, sediment-heavy water that covered the fields completely for several weeks before slowly retreating, leaving behind it the rich dark silt that would support the next year's crop. From the desert bluffs above the valley floor, the scene was extraordinary. A silver mirror stretching from cliff to cliff, with the tops of the tallest trees and the upper courses of the mud brick walls of the villages rising from the water, like the remnants of a civilization glimpsed between waves. During the inundation, ordinary agricultural work was impossible. The fields were underwater. The farmers, who had spent the rest of the year bent over their plots or hauling water or threshing grain, were free. And the state, with its characteristically Egyptian genius for organization, put that free labor to work on the great building projects that defined the civilization. The pyramids, the temples, the causeways and harbors and administrative buildings of the pharaonic state were built largely by this seasonal labor force. Farmers turned to construction workers for the months when the land was underwater, well fed and modestly compensated by a state that understood the relationship between satisfied workers and durable monuments. The pharaoh who directed all of this was, in the Egyptian theological framework, not merely a king in the political sense, but a living god, or more precisely a being in whom the divine and the human were merged, who was the son of Ra, the physical manifestation of Horus, and the future Osiris. The divine blood of the pharaoh was the source of the Nile's flood, of the fertility of the land, of the order that kept the cosmos from collapsing into chaos. When the pharaoh performed the rituals of the state religion, he was not merely acting as a representative of the divine. He was, in a very real theological sense, the divine acting in the world, the channel through which the power of the gods flowed into human experience. The maintenance of this divine blood was a matter of supreme importance to the Egyptian state, and the records of royal genealogy, the lists of royal marriages, the careful documentation of descent from one pharaoh to the next, reflect the seriousness with which the question of bloodline was treated. The principle of brother-sister marriage within the royal family, which modern observers often find troubling, was not, or not primarily, an expression of incestuous desire, but a deliberate strategy for keeping the divine blood concentrated within the royal line, preventing its dilution through marriage to individuals of lesser or purely human descent. Whether this strategy produced the biological effects that the Egyptians hoped for is one question. that they believed deeply and sincerely in the principle behind it is not in doubt. Among the pharaohs who have attracted the most attention from those who study the question of Rh-negative blood and ancient divine bloodlines, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten stands out with particular vividness. Akhenaten, who ruled in the 14th century before the Common Era and who introduced a radical religious reformation that tried to replace Egypt's traditional pantheon with the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, has fascinated scholars and theorists since his monuments were first rediscovered in the 19th century. His physical appearance, as represented in the surviving statuary and relief carvings of his reign, is distinctly unusual. Elongated skull, full lips, narrow eyes, long neck, wide hips, a physical type that is quite different from the standard idealized representation of the Egyptian ruler, and that has led to numerous medical and pseudo-medical theories about what condition, if any, it reflects. Some have proposed that Akhenaten suffered from a genetic disorder affecting physical development. Others have suggested that the representations are deliberate artistic choices, expressing theological ideas about the pharaoh's androgynous divine nature. A smaller but vocal minority has proposed, in the context of the Rh-negative blood mystery, that Akhenaten's unusual physical features are the expression of a genetic heritage that was different from the mainstream Egyptian population, a heritage that included, in their interpretation, a higher concentration of whatever genetic traits are associated with Rh-negative blood, and its accompanying physical and neurological characteristics. This last interpretation is speculative and not supported by any direct evidence. The mummy of Akhenaten has not been definitively identified, and no blood type data exists for him or for most other ancient Egyptian rulers. What can be said is that the Egyptian royal lineage, with its intense focus on maintaining a distinct bloodline, its theological insistence on the divine nature of royal blood, and the physical peculiarities visible in some of its most famous members, represents one of the strongest ancient expressions of the idea that a special lineage carries something that ordinary human blood does not. And that idea, in this story, is not peripheral, it is central. The sun sets over the Nile Valley in a long, slow performance of colour, the sky going from pale blue to gold to orange to a deep red that reflects in the surface of the river and turns the water briefly the colour of blood before the darkness comes and the stars appear, bright and multiple and close in the clear dry air of the Egyptian night. The great monuments on the West Bank, which have stood through uncounted sunsets, hold their positions against the darkening sky with the patient solidity of things that do not need to be in a hurry. They have been there for a long time. They will be there for a long time yet, and in the blood of the living somewhere in that vast and quiet landscape, something old continues to move forward through time, one generation at a time, carrying whatever it carries, waiting for the moment when the tools exist to read it clearly. That moment was still a long way off, as the stars wheeled overhead, and the Nile settled into its nighttime quietness, and the ancient world turned slowly on its axis toward whatever came next. The Hebrew texts are among the most studied documents in human history, read and reread by more people across more centuries than almost any other body of writing. They have been translated into hundreds of languages, copied by hand through thousands of years, interpreted and debated and argued over by scholars and theologians and ordinary readers in every corner of the world where literacy has taken hold. And yet, despite all of this attention, despite the sheer weight of commentary and analysis that surrounds them, there are passages in those ancient texts that continue to resist easy explanation, passages that sit quietly in the middle of otherwise familiar narratives and emit, for those who stop to read them carefully, a low and steady signal of strangeness that centuries of interpretive tradition have not entirely absorbed. One of the most striking of these passages appears in the 6th chapter of Genesis, in the verses that precede the story of Noah and the flood. The passage is brief, only a few sentences, but its implications have occupied theologians and scholars, and more recently theorists of every description for a very long time. It describes, with a matter-of-fact brevity that is itself somewhat unsettling, the existence of beings called the sons of God, who looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and who took them as wives. The children born of these unions are described as the Nephilim, a word whose precise meaning is debated but which is often translated as the fallen ones or the giants, and they are said to have been mighty men of old, men of renown. That is essentially all the text says. It does not explain who the sons of God were, where they came from, or what happened to the Nephilim and their descendants. It simply states the fact of their existence and their mixing with the human population, and then moves on to the story of Noah, leaving the reader to make of those few sentences whatever they will. The passage has the quality of a fragment, something that may once have been longer, that may have been part of a more detailed account, but that has been compressed or edited into its current brief form by the hands that shaped the final version of the text. Jewish interpretive tradition has offered several readings of this passage. The most conservative theological reading identifies the sons of God as the righteous descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam, who married the daughters of the descendants of Cain, with the Nephilim being the morally compromised offspring of that union rather than literal giants or semi-divine beings. A more mystical reading, found in texts like the Book of Enoch, which was considered scriptural by some early Jewish and Christian communities, but was eventually excluded from the canonical Hebrew Bible, describes the sons of God as actual angelic beings, the Watchers, who descended to earth, taught human beings forbidden knowledge, and fathered children who became the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and voracious appetite whose violence and corruption was one of the reasons the divine decided to send the flood. The Book of Enoch, preserved most completely in an Ethiopic translation, and recovered in partial form among the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran in the late 1940s, is an extraordinary text. It describes in considerable detail the descent of the Watchers. It gives their number as 200, lists many of their names, describes the specific kinds of forbidden knowledge each one taught to the humans they encountered, and provides a lengthy account of the size and behaviour of the Nephilim, their children. The Nephilim in the Book of Enoch are not simply large or powerful people. They are described as beings whose nature is genuinely different from ordinary humanity, whose appetites and capacities exceed human norms in every direction, and whose presence in the world represents a disruption of the natural order that the divine authority finds deeply troubling. Whether one reads this text as literal history, as theological allegory, as the reflection of ancient memory of actual events, or as something else entirely depends enormously on one's prior commitments and interpretive framework. What is beyond dispute is that the text exists, that it is ancient, that it was taken seriously as a spiritual and historical document by communities that had access to it, and that the ideas it contains, the mixing of divine and human blood, the production of a lineage that carries something different, the connection between that lineage and both great capability and great disruption, are ideas that appear in various forms across an extraordinary range of ancient cultures and traditions. The question of what the Nephilim were and what became of them, and whether their descendants are still walking among the living human population, is one that the Rh-negative blood theorists have engaged with extensively. The argument, in its most developed form, runs approximately as follows. The sons of God who mixed with human women were beings of a different biological type than ordinary humanity, carrying genetic material that was in some respects different from the standard human genome. The offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, carried this different genetic material in diluted form, mixed with ordinary human genetics, producing individuals who are mostly human, but who retained certain characteristics of the divine parent. As the generations passed and the bloodlines continued to mix, the proportion of the divine or non-human genetic material decreased in most lineages, but in certain families, in certain populations, it persisted in higher concentrations, and the biological marker of this persistence in this interpretation is the Rh-negative blood type, the absence of the I antigen, which may represent not a loss, but an original state, the original condition of the non-human ancestors whose blood first entered the human population at that ancient mixing. This argument is not accepted by mainstream science, and the objections to it are numerous and substantial. The Rh antigen is well understood at the molecular level, and its absence in Rh-negative individuals is the result of specific genetic variants that have been mapped and studied in considerable detail. There is no evidence in the genetic data for a non-human or extraterrestrial contribution to the human genome at any point in our evolutionary history, and the genetic differences between Rh-positive and Rh-negative individuals, while real and medically significant, are not of the order that would suggest descent from a different species or a different biological origin. The mainstream scientific consensus on human origins places all modern humans within a single species, Homo sapiens, descended from populations that evolved in Africa over the past several 100,000 years, with no contribution from non-terrestrial sources. And yet, The persistence of the theory, its emotional resonance with large numbers of people, its ability to connect dots between phenomena that do seem genuinely puzzling. The isolated distribution of arch-negative blood, the linguistic isolation of the Basques, the consistent cross-cultural mythology of divine human mixing, the medical strangeness of Rh incompatibility, all of this suggests that the theory is touching something real, even if what it is touching is not quite what it thinks it is touching. The mystery is genuine, even if the most dramatic explanations for it do not hold up to scrutiny. The puzzle pieces are real, even if the picture they are being assembled into may not be the right one. Let us sit with that tension for a moment, in the quiet of the night, without rushing to resolve it in either direction. The facts are these. A specific blood type is distributed across the human population in a pattern that is not entirely explained by current genetic models. The populations in which it is most concentrated are among the oldest and most genetically isolated in the regions where they live. The cultures and traditions associated with these populations share, with cultures from very different parts of the world, a set of ideas about divine bloodlines, the mixing of human and non-human origins, and the significance of lineage as a carrier of spiritual capacity. These facts are real. What they mean is still being worked out, and the working out is happening simultaneously in genetics laboratories and in the imaginations of people lying awake in the dark, listening to the fan turn and wondering about their own blood and what it carries. The ancient world of the Levant, the coastal and inland strip of land that connects Egypt to Mesopotamia, and that was, in the second and first millennia before the Common Era, one of the most contested and consequential pieces of real estate on Earth, was a place where bloodlines were tracked with extraordinary care and recorded with extraordinary attention. The Hebrew tradition of genealogy, the long lists of who begat whom that appear throughout the books of Genesis and Chronicles and Numbers, are sometimes experienced by modern readers as among the most tedious passages in the biblical text. But in the context of the culture that produced them, these genealogies were anything but tedious. They were among the most important documents a community could possess, because they established the identity of every person within the community in terms that connected them to the founding figures of the tradition, and, through those figures, to the divine authority that had made the community what it was. The genealogies also preserved, in their careful tracking of descent, a record of which families had intermarried with which other families, which lineages had remained within the community, and which had mixed with outsiders, and what the religious and communal status of the resulting descendants should be, for a community that placed enormous theological significance on the purity of the bloodline, the line that ran from Abraham through Isaac through Jacob, through the 12 sons of Jacob to the 12 tribes of Israel. This was not merely administrative record-keeping, it was the maintenance of a sacred trust, the preservation of a covenant that was understood to run through the blood as surely as it ran through the law. The covenant between the divine and the line of Abraham is one of the central theological concepts of the Hebrew tradition, and it is expressed in the text in a way that makes the blood connection explicit. The sign of the covenant is circumcision, a mark made in the flesh, in the very body, in the physical blood of the male descendants of Abraham. This is not a symbolic gesture in the abstract sense. It is a literal marking of the body, an inscription in the flesh of the covenant relationship, a physical claim on the blood of the descendant by the divine authority that made the original agreement with the ancestor. The covenant runs through the body, it runs through the blood, and the children who carry it are, by virtue of that blood, in a different relationship to the divine than those who do not. Whether or not one reads this theological framework as literally true, its structure is identical to the structure of the divine bloodline belief found in Sumer, in Egypt, in the Celtic tradition, in the traditions of ancient India and ancient China and ancient Mesoamerica. In every case, the divine favour, the special capacity, the elevated spiritual status is transmitted through the blood, carried from one generation to the next by the mechanism of descent. In every case, those who carry the appropriate blood are understood to have access to something, a relationship with the divine, a kind of knowledge, a quality of perception or capacity that others do not have. And in every case, the preservation of the bloodline is treated as a matter of serious and sometimes desperate importance. The morning in ancient Jerusalem in the centuries when the temple stood on its great platform above the city would have begun with the sound of the priests preparing for the day's rituals. The smell of burning fat and cedar wood would have reached the lower city before the light was fully established, drifting down from the Temple Mount on the still morning air, and the people going about their daily business in the markets and workshops below would have known by that smell that the ritual was proceeding as it should, that the relationship between the community and the divine was being tended by those whose lineage made them appropriate for the task. The priests of the Jerusalem temple, the Kohanim, were, and in the genetic sense still are, a distinct lineage within the Jewish people. The priesthood passed from father to son in an unbroken chain going back to Aaron, the brother of Moses, and the tradition was maintained with sufficient care that the descendants of the priestly lineage can still be identified today, thousands of years later, by a distinctive pattern in their Y chromosome, the genetic material that passes unchanged from father to son through generations. This genetic signature, known in population genetics as the Cohen modal haplotype, has been confirmed in Jewish communities across the world, from the Middle East to Europe to India to Ethiopia, suggesting that the lineage was genuinely preserved through the diaspora with remarkable consistency. The Cohen modal haplotype is one of the most dramatic confirmations in the modern era of what the ancient world believed about bloodlines, that they are real, that they persist through time, that the blood genuinely carries something forward from the original ancestor to the living descendants in a way that is measurable and specific. It does not of itself confirm any of the more dramatic theories about the origin of those bloodlines or the nature of what they carry. But it does establish with scientific rigor that the ancient conviction about the persistence and importance of lineage was not simply wishful thinking. It was based on a genuine biological reality. The ancient world also held, in many of its traditions, beliefs about the physical and temperamental characteristics associated with particular bloodlines. The idea that certain families produced people who were unusually tall, or unusually intelligent, or unusually gifted at particular arts, or unusually prone to particular kinds of spiritual experience was not experienced as a metaphor. It was experienced as an observation. The kind of observation that any community makes when it watches several generations of the same family and notices the patterns that recur. Modern genetics confirms that such observations were not without basis. Heritable traits, including not only physical features like height and hair color, but also cognitive tendencies, temperamental dispositions, and even certain kinds of spiritual or perceptual sensitivity, do indeed cluster in families and run through lineages, because they are, in varying degrees, encoded in the genome and passed from parent to child, along with everything else the genome carries. The specific traits that various researchers and writers have associated with Rh-negative blood carriers: higher than average intuition, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, a tendency towards certain kinds of psychic or paranormal experience, unusual eye colors, higher than average IQ, a sense of not fully belonging to the ordinary human community, are claims that range from the scientifically testable to the entirely anecdotal, and the scientific evidence for most of them is weak or non-existent. Blood type, including Rh factor, is a relatively narrow genetic marker, and there is no well-established mechanism by which the presence or absence of the Rh antigen would directly produce the range of psychological and perceptual traits that some researchers have attributed to Rh-negative carriers. But the persistence of these claims, and the emotional weight they carry for the people who make them, is itself informative. It suggests that there is something in the human experience of difference, a sense that one's perceptions or responses or relationship to the world are somehow not quite aligned with the majority. That needs an explanation, and that the explanation of bloodline, of ancient inheritance, of carrying something from a source other than the ordinary human stream, is one of the most compelling explanations available. The desire to understand oneself in terms of where one's blood came from is very old, and it is not easily satisfied by purely statistical accounts of genetic variation. The river Euphrates, in the late spring when the snowmelt from the northern mountains was at its peak, ran swift and brown and cold, carrying with it the topsoil of distant highlands and depositing it on the flat plain where it would eventually become the soil of the next year's crops. The farmers who worked those fields, men and women who had inherited their plots from their parents and would pass them to their children, who knew the specific qualities of each section of ground, which areas drained well and which held water, where the soil was deepest and most fertile, understood inheritance in the most immediate and practical terms. What you had from those who came before you. What you would pass on, you had received. The thread ran through you and your task was to keep it unbroken. This is a simple truth, but it is also a profound one, and it underlies everything in this story. Whatever the blood carries, whether it carries the memory of ancient divine contact as the mythological traditions suggest, or whether it carries merely the accumulated genetic variations of a long-isolated population, as the scientific account describes, or whether the truth lies somewhere in a region that the current tools of both mythology and science are not yet fully equipped to map, it carries it forward through time with a fidelity and a patience that puts all other forms of memory to shame. The stone monuments weather, the written texts decay or burn, the languages change beyond recognition. But the blood persists, moving forward through the generations, marking its carriers in ways that are both visible and invisible, waiting to be read by those who have learned the language in which it writes. A generation passed in that ancient land, and then another, and the thread continued, one careful breath at a time. The Berber peoples of North Africa, who have occupied the mountains and plains and deserts of the Maghreb since before the historical record begins, represent another of the populations in which elevated frequencies of each negative blood have been consistently documented. The Berbers, who call themselves Imazigen, meaning the free people, are the indigenous inhabitants of the region that stretches from the Atlantic coast of Morocco eastward through Algeria and Tunisia and into Libya and beyond. They preceded the Arab conquest of the 7th century of the Common Era by millennia, and they preceded the Phoenician and Roman and Byzantine presences in the region by an even longer period. Their own traditions speak of an origin in the ancient past that connects them to peoples of great antiquity, and the genetic data confirms that they are indeed one of the oldest populations in the region, carrying a genetic signature that is distinct from both their sub-Saharan African neighbours and their Middle Eastern and European neighbours. The concentration of Rh-negative blood among certain Berber populations, particularly the highland Berbers of the Atlas Mountains and the Rif, has attracted attention in the context of the broader mystery. The Atlas Mountains, rising to considerable heights along the backbone of northwestern Africa, have functioned throughout history as a refuge, a place where populations retreating from conquest or displacement could find shelter in the high valleys and maintain their identity and their genetic distinctiveness over many centuries. The Berbers of the Atlas are among the most genetically isolated populations in Africa, and their relatively high rates of Rh-negative blood are part of a genetic profile that reflects that isolation and that ancient origin. The ancient Egyptians who traded and occasionally conflicted with the Libyan populations to their west, populations that were, in all likelihood, the ancestors or close relatives of some modern Berber groups, depicted these Westerners in their tomb paintings with features that distinguished them clearly from the brown-skinned Egyptians of the valley. Lighter skin, reddish or blonde hair, blue or green eyes. These are physical features that are associated, in general population terms, with elevated frequencies of certain genetic traits, including, in some analyses, a higher tendency toward Rh-negative blood. Whether the connection is direct or merely correlative is not established, but the Egyptian record of Western neighbours who looked different from the Nile Valley population is consistent with the presence, in those Western populations, of a genetic heritage that was distinct from the mainstream. The evening in the Atlas Mountains falls quickly, the sun dropping behind the western ridges and pulling the warmth of the day with it almost immediately, leaving the high valleys in a sudden coolness that makes the skin contract and the lungs draw in the thin air with a new awareness of its freshness. The Berber villages perched on the hillsides, their flat-roofed houses built from the same stone as the mountain itself, almost invisible against the rock face at a distance, settle into their evening routines with the particular efficiency of people who know that darkness in the mountains is complete and early and requires preparation. The fires are lit, the animals brought in, the doors secured against the mountain cold, and in the firelight, the old stories are told, stories of origins, of ancient movements across the land, of times when the people were different and the world was differently ordered. These stories, like the stories of the Basques, and the stories of the ancient Irish, and the stories carved into the walls of Mesopotamian temples, are full of the same recurring elements. A people with unusual qualities, a lineage that carries something beyond the ordinary, a long history of being set apart, watched, sometimes persecuted, sometimes revered. The stories are not identical, the names are different, the landscapes are different, the specific details of the mythology are shaped by the particular environment and history of the people telling them. but the underlying structure is the same, and that structural similarity, repeated across so many separate traditions, is the thing that refuses to be explained away. The night is deep around you now, and the world outside has grown very still. The stars, if you could see them through whatever roof or ceiling lies between you and the sky, are the same stars that look down on the ancient Basques in their oak forests and the Berbers in their mountain villages and the priests of Ur climbing the steps of the ziggurat in the early morning light. The same stars, the same light, the same patterns of constellation that the ancient skywatchers mapped with such care and associated with such meaning. And somewhere under those stars in the blood of the living, the old mystery continues to move forward, one heartbeat at a time. The question of what Rh-negative blood actually is, at the molecular level, is one that modern science can answer with considerable precision. The R blood group system is one of the most complex blood group systems in human genetics, comprising a large number of distinct antigens encoded by two closely linked genes on chromosome 1. The most clinically significant of these antigens is the Rhd antigen, whose presence or absence defines the Rh-positive and Rh-negative designation that most people encounter in medical contexts. Individuals who are Rh-negative lack the Rhd antigen entirely, not because they have a gene that suppresses it, but because they have a deletion, an absence of the gene that would produce it. In a genetic sense, being Rh-negative is defined by what is not there rather than by what is. This is itself a curious feature, and it has contributed to the sense of mystery that surrounds the Rh-negative blood type. In evolutionary genetics, the persistence of a trait that is defined by the absence of something is somewhat unusual. Normally, natural selection favours the presence of traits that confer advantage, not the absence of traits. The deletion that produces Rh-negative blood has presumably been maintained in the population because it confers some advantage, or at least because it does not confer sufficient disadvantage to be eliminated. But what that advantage might be is not clearly established. Some researchers have proposed that Rh-negative blood confers resistance to certain parasites or pathogens. There is some evidence that Rh-negative individuals may have somewhat different susceptibility profiles to certain diseases, including some parasitic infections, but the data is not conclusive and the mechanism is not well understood. Others have proposed that the persistence of the Rs-negative trait is simply a matter of genetic drift in small, isolated populations, that by chance, the trait became common in populations like the ancestral Basques, and that once it was common, the social structures of those communities preserved it through preferential mating within the group. The genetic drift explanation is probably the most straightforwardly satisfying from a mainstream scientific perspective. Small, isolated populations are subject to random fluctuations in gene frequency that can push any trait, regardless of its adaptive value, to high frequency simply by chance. If the ancestral Basque population was small and isolated for a sufficiently long period, which the evidence suggests it was, then even a trait that might otherwise have been selected against could have drifted to high frequency, and then been maintained by subsequent isolation. This is a perfectly coherent account that requires no special explanation, no divine ancestry, no extraterrestrial genetic engineering. And yet the scientific account, even at its most thorough, does not fully close the question. The geographic pattern of Rh-negative blood is still not entirely explained. The specific populations in which it is elevated still share features, cultural, mythological, archaeological, that are not obviously related to the genetic story. The cross-cultural mythology of divine bloodlines and divine human mixing is still not accounted for by any purely genetic narrative, and the medical strangeness of Rh incompatibility, the fact that an Rh-negative mother's immune system treats an Rh-positive fetus as a foreign invader, mounting an immune response against it as if the fetus were a disease rather than a child, is still, for all its medical explanation, a biological phenomenon that sits somewhat uneasily in the framework of standard evolutionary theory. The immune system attack on an Rh-positive fetus by an Rh-negative mother is, from a purely biological perspective, a form of self-rejection. The mother's body is rejecting something that is half her own genetic material, treating it as alien. The antigen that triggers this response, the Rhd antigen present on the fetal red blood cells, is the thing her body cannot recognize as self, the thing that marks the fetal blood as other. In the language of mythology, you could read this as the body's memory of an ancient incompatibility, a biological echo of the original mixing of two different biological types whose union produced something, that was not fully recognizable to either parent as fully their own. That is a poetic reading, not a scientific one. But the poetry of the image, the body remembering at the cellular level the strangeness of an ancient union, is not without its resonance. Years passed, and the seasons turned, and the ancient world moved toward the period when the long threads of its separate civilizations would begin to converge, to cross and recross in ways that would permanently change the distribution of blood and culture and belief across the face of the earth. Continue. The great migrations of the ancient world were not events in the way that modern people tend to think of events: concentrated, datable, visible in a particular year or decade. They were processes, slow and cumulative, driven by pressures that accumulated over generations and expressed themselves not in dramatic marches of armies, but in the steady drift of families and communities, season by season, year by year, moving along the edges of the land they knew into the land they did not yet know, following water and game and the reports of scouts and the accumulated knowledge of trade routes that stretched across distances no single person would have been able to walk in a lifetime. The Indo-European expansion, which fundamentally reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe and much of Asia in the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era, was the largest and most consequential of these processes. The people who carried the Indo-European languages, the ancestors of the modern speakers of the hundreds of languages that belonged to that family, from Irish in the west to Bengali in the east, from Norwegian in the north to Sinhalese in the south, moved outward from their original homeland in the steppe regions north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, spreading their languages, their herding economy, their mythology, and their genetic material across an enormous swathe of the inhabited world over a period of several thousand years. The genetic impact of this expansion is clearly visible in the ancient DNA data that has been generated in recent years from archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. The steppe ancestry associated with the Indo-European expansion appears in European populations from around 4,500 years ago, increasing over subsequent centuries as the expanding steppe populations mixed with the existing farmers and hunter-gatherers of Europe. The result was the complex genetic mosaic that characterizes modern European populations, a layering of at least 3 distinct ancestral groups: the original hunter-gatherers, the early farmers who came from Anatolia, and the later steppe migrants whose arrival brought the Indo-European languages. The populations that are now known for their elevated arc-negative frequencies, the Basques, the Atlantic Celtic populations, certain Berber groups, are precisely the populations in which this steppe ancestry is least prevalent, the populations that were most isolated from the main currents of the Indo-European expansion, the populations that preserved the most of the pre-Indo-European genetic substrate of Western Europe. This is consistent with the idea that the arc-negative trait is ancient in Western Europe, predating the Indo-European migrations, and that its current distribution reflects the survival of an old trait in the populations that were least affected by the subsequent genetic mixing. This is an elegant explanation, and it fits the data reasonably well, but it raises a further question. Where did the ancestral Western European population, the pre-Indo-European substrate, originally come from? And why did they carry Rh-negative blood in such high frequencies? The ancient DNA data can trace the European populations back to the Upper Paleolithic hunters and to the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, but it cannot reach all the way back to the ultimate origin of the Rh-negative trait, because ancient DNA degrades over time, and the techniques for extracting and analyzing it become less reliable the older the samples are. The very oldest human populations of Western Europe, the people who may have carried the highest concentrations of Rh-negative blood, are in many cases beyond the current reach of ancient DNA analysis. And so, the question of ultimate origin remains open. It remains open in the scientific literature, where researchers continue to generate and analyze new data, and it remains open in the wider culture, where the mystery continues to attract the attention of people who feel, for whatever reason, that the question is important, that the answer, when it comes, will matter in a way that goes beyond the merely academic. The wide plain of the Eurasian steppe, stretching from the Danube to the Yenisei, in an almost unbroken grassland of several million square kilometers, was in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era home to communities of remarkable mobility and remarkable adaptability. The people who lived there, the Yamnaya culture and its descendants, who are the primary candidates for the original Indo-European speakers, were herders who had domesticated the horse and developed the wheel and the wagon. technologies that gave them a capacity for movement that the farming peoples of the surrounding regions could not match. They could move their entire households, their animals, their tools, and their social structures across vast distances in a way that was simply not possible for communities tied to permanent fields and fixed settlements. Their expansion was not a single-directed campaign, but an ongoing process of movement and mixing, with groups budding off from the main population and moving in new directions, establishing themselves in new territories, mixing with the local populations they encountered, absorbing some and displacing others, changing in the process but carrying their language and certain core elements of their culture forward into each new context. The language families that descended from their original tongue, Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Slavic, Greek, Indo-Iranian and the rest, spread across the world not because the original speakers conquered everyone they met, but because enough of their language and culture was absorbed by the populations they mixed with to change the fundamental structure of those populations' speech. Into this long process of mixing and movement, the question of blood type enters in a way that is, in retrospect, entirely predictable. As the Indo-European population spread into Western Europe and mixed with the existing inhabitants, the frequency of Rh-negative blood in the resulting mixed populations fell because the steppe migrants carried predominantly Rh-positive blood. The more thorough the mixing, the lower the Rh-negative frequency. The more isolated a population remained from this mixing, the more it was protected by geography or by cultural barriers from full integration into the expanding Indo-European world, the higher its Rh-negative frequency remained. The Basque country, with its mountain barriers, its cultural distinctiveness, and its linguistic impenetrability, was among the most effectively isolated of the pre-Indo-European territories. The mountains that define its borders are not the highest in Europe, but they are sufficient to have channeled movement and discouraged casual mixing with the populations on either side. And the Basque language, so completely unlike the surrounding tongues, created a cultural barrier of equal effectiveness to the geographic one. You cannot easily marry into a community whose language you cannot speak, and you cannot easily speak a language whose structure is utterly unlike anything in your own linguistic experience. The Basque linguistic isolation was, in a very practical sense, a barrier to genetic mixing, and the result is the extraordinary genetic profile that makes this population such a focus of scientific and popular attention. Along the Atlantic coast to the north, the populations of what would become Ireland and Scotland and Wales were similarly protected by geography, by the water that separated the British Isles from the continent, and by the internal geography of mountains and marshes and dense forest that made large-scale movement through the interior difficult and expensive. The Celtic languages that were eventually brought to these regions by the Indo-European expansion did change the linguistic landscape, but the genetic landscape changed more slowly and less completely, with the pre-existing populations contributing a substantial proportion of the ancestry of the modern inhabitants. And in that pre-existing genetic contribution, the Rh-negative trait persisted and continues to persist at elevated rates. The daily life of the people who carried these ancient blood types, in the period before the written record, can be reconstructed only in broad outline from the archaeological evidence. They lived in small settlements, typically of a few dozen to a few hundred people, organised around kinship and the practical necessities of the mixed economy of farming and herding that sustained them. Their houses were built from whatever materials the local environment provided: wood in the forested regions, stone in the uplands, turf in the bogs, wattle and daub in the lowlands. The interiors were dim and smoky, lit by hearth fire and the occasional rushlight, and the smell of smoke and animals and food and unwashed bodies and the outdoors was a constant that those who lived in it would have barely registered, having grown up surrounded by it from birth. The children of these communities grew up knowing, from very early on, exactly who they were in relation to everyone else in the settlement. They knew their place in the kinship structure with a precision that modern urban dwellers rarely experience. They knew whose child they were, whose grandchild, who their cousins were and in what degree, which families had intermarried with, which over how many generations. This knowledge was not merely social or sentimental, it was practical. It determined who you could marry, who you could ask for help in a crisis, who you were obligated to help in return, and who you were obligated to avenge if they were harmed. The network of kinship was the social infrastructure of the community, and blood was its foundation. In communities structured this way, a person whose blood was understood to be different, who came from a family known for unusual qualities, who had parents or grandparents who were remembered as healers or seers or leaders of unusual capacity, occupied a particular position, not necessarily a comfortable one. The unusual person in a small community is watched with a mixture of reverence and suspicion, valued for what their difference might provide and feared for what it might portend. The healer whose remedies work better than expected, the seer whose predictions come true with unsettling frequency, the leader whose calm in a crisis seems to come from a place deeper than ordinary courage. These people were noticed, and the noticing had consequences. In some communities, in some periods, the consequence was elevation. The unusual person was given the role that matched their unusual quality, and the community organized its relationship to them accordingly. In other communities, in other periods, the consequence was exclusion or worse. The history of human communities' treatment of those who seem different is a long and complicated one, full of both reverence and violence, often simultaneously. And the people who carried the traits associated with the ancient lineages, the healers and the seers and the ones who seemed to stand slightly apart from the ordinary current of social life, experienced both ends of that spectrum across the long centuries. The European witch trials of the late medieval and early modern period, which consumed somewhere between 40 and 60,000 lives over a period of roughly 3 centuries, have been interpreted in many ways by many historians. The standard historical analysis focuses on social stress, religious anxiety, gender dynamics, and the particular vulnerabilities of marginal members of small communities. But there is a persistent undercurrent in the popular literature on this period that connects the witch trials to the persecution of people who carried, in their family histories and their personal characteristics, traces of the older tradition, the pre-Christian, pre-Indo-European tradition of the healer and the seer and the keeper of the old knowledge. Whether or not this interpretation is historically sound, it reflects the same underlying intuition that runs through much of the Oz-negative discussion, that there is a lineage of difference, ancient and persistent, and that the history of that lineage is a history of both special capacity and special vulnerability. The smell of incense in an old church, rising in thin blue columns toward the vaulted ceiling, has something of the quality of the smoke that rose from the ziggurat offerings in ancient Ur, and something of the quality of the resin fires that burned at the megalithic monuments of the Atlantic coast before any church existed in those lands. The human instinct to mark certain spaces as sacred, to fill them with smoke and scent and the particular quality of attention that attends ritual, is older than any of the specific religious traditions that have channeled it, and the people who tended those sacred spaces, the priests and priestesses and shamans and wise women and keepers of the flame, in whatever culture and whatever period, were in most cases people who came from families with a tradition of that kind of service. Their blood, in the ordinary human sense, carried the memory of the role. The Druids of the ancient Celtic world, about whom the Roman writers wrote with a combination of fascination and horror, were one of the most sophisticated priestly and intellectual castes of the ancient world outside the classical civilizations. They served as priests, judges, teachers, historians, and philosophical scholars, maintaining a body of knowledge so extensive that their training required, according to Roman sources, up to 20 years of memorization, because the Druids, deliberately and on principle, did not commit their knowledge to writing, preferring to maintain it in the living memory of trained practitioners. The knowledge was carried in the blood of the institution, in the succession of teacher to student, maintained across many generations, and when the institution was destroyed by Roman military action and by the subsequent spread of Christianity, the knowledge was largely lost, because the people who carried it in their memories were gone, and nothing had been written down. The Druids drew their membership from the aristocratic families of Celtic society, and their tradition emphasized the importance of lineage in determining eligibility for the deepest levels of the teaching. Not everyone could become a Druid, regardless of their intelligence or their dedication. You had to come from the right family, carry the right blood, be of the appropriate descent. This is consistent with the pattern found in every priestly caste of the ancient world, and it points toward the same underlying conviction, that the capacity to stand between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it is not a skill that can be entirely taught. It is, at least in part, inherited. The great oak forests of Britain and Gaul, where the Druids conducted their most important rituals, have been gone for many centuries, replaced by farmland and pasture and eventually by cities. The sacred groves, the Nemeton, as the Celtic languages called them, where the rituals of the year were performed and where the most important decisions of the community were made, are now fields or housing developments or shopping centres, their sacred character visible only to those who know where to look and what to look for. But the blood of the people who made those groves sacred is still in the world, moving through the bodies of their descendants, unchanged in its fundamental chemistry, even as everything around it has been transformed. By the opening centuries of the Common Era, the ancient world was in the process of one of its most dramatic transformations. The Roman Empire had reached its greatest extent, binding together an enormous territory from Britain to Mesopotamia under a single administrative and military framework. The Silk Road was carrying goods and ideas between China and Rome, with a regularity and volume that would not be seen again until the modern era. The first stirrings of what would become the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism already ancient, Christianity newly born, Islam not yet even a generation into the future, were beginning to reshape the spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean world. And in all of this movement and mixing and transformation, the blood moved with the people, mixing and separating and concentrating and dispersing in patterns that would take 2,000 more years to begin to unravel. The Roman Empire was, among many other things, one of the greatest engines of genetic mixing in the ancient world. Its armies recruited from across the empire and beyond, and the soldiers who served their terms and then retired took with them whatever blood they carried to wherever they settled, mixing it into the local population. The trading networks of the empire moved people as surely as they moved goods, and the cities of the empire were melting pots whose genetic diversity would have astonished anyone who assumed that the ancient world was a place of fixed and separate peoples. In this mix, the Art-negative trait moved with its carriers, spreading somewhat beyond its original Atlantic and Berber concentrations, but remaining highest in the populations that were least thoroughly absorbed into the Roman mixing machine. A generation later, the empire began to contract. The external pressures from the north and east, the Gothic and Hunnic peoples pushing against the Rhine and Danube frontiers, were matched by internal pressures of economic strain and political instability. The great cities of the Western Empire shrank. The road network deteriorated. The administrative apparatus that had held the enormous territory together began to fragment into smaller units that would eventually become the kingdoms of medieval Europe. And in that fragmentation, the genetic geography of Western Europe began to take on the shape that it would maintain, with modifications into the modern era, with the Atlantic populations preserving their ancient genetic heritage most completely, and the arch-negative trait remaining most concentrated in those same ancient Western populations. The smoke from the last fires of the Roman world rose into the evening air of the 5th century and drifted westward, toward the Atlantic, toward the island of Britain where the legions had already departed, toward the Basque hills where the Roman presence had always been relatively light, toward the coast of Morocco where the last Roman administrators were losing their grip on the cities they had built. And the people who lived in those places, the Basques in their hills, the Irish in their islands, the Berbers in their mountains, watched the smoke and continued to do what they had always done, tend their animals, plant their crops, tell their stories, and pass their blood carefully forward to the next generation. The mystery that was carried in that blood was not something any of them could have articulated in the terms that a modern geneticist would use, but in their stories, in their religious practices, in the particular reverence with which certain families and certain bloodlines were treated in their communities, the awareness of something special in the lineage persisted, quiet and unhurried, waiting for the time when it would be possible to ask the right questions. That time was still many centuries away, but the blood was patient. It had always been patient. It moved forward through time at the only speed available to it, one generation at a time, one heartbeat at a time, carrying its mystery in the silent architecture of the cell. The soft dark of the night is very complete now, and the world outside is still. The fan turns its slow circle, and the breath comes and goes with the easy rhythm of a body that is beginning to let go of the day. Let the ancient world settle around you like a familiar dream. The oak forests and the river valleys, the ziggurats and the standing stones, the priests climbing their steps in the early morning light, and the shepherds moving their flocks along paths worn smooth by generations of the same passage. All of it resting now as the story continues to unfold in the quiet dark. Continue. The medieval world that emerged from the ruins of the Western Roman Empire was, in many respects, a world organized around blood. The feudal system, whatever its economic and political complexities, was fundamentally a system of inherited status in which the land you held, the obligations you owed, and the rights you could claim were all determined by the blood you carried, by who your father was and his father before him, and so on back through the generations to the original grant of land or title that established the family's position in the hierarchy. Kings ruled by divine right, a theological concept that located the authority to govern not in the consent of the governed, or in any personal merit of the ruler, but in the blood of the royal line, understood to have been set apart by the divine will for the purpose of ruling. This was not a cynical invention of the powerful to justify their power, though it certainly served that function. It was, at a deeper level, the continuation of a conviction about blood and lineage that reached back through the Roman imperial cult, through the divine kingship of the ancient Near East, through the shamanic traditions of the pre-agricultural world, to the very earliest human sense that certain lineages carried something that other lineages did not. The medieval king was, in the theological imagination of his time, a figure in a direct line of descent from the sacred kings of the ancient world, the priest-kings who had stood at the intersection of the human and the divine, and through whose blood the divine order had entered and organized the human world. The royal houses of medieval Europe were deeply conscious of their bloodlines, and maintained them with a care that expressed itself in the elaborate system of dynastic marriage that defined European political history for more than a millennium. The great families of Europe, the Carolingians, the Capetians, the Plantagenets, the Habsburgs, arranged marriages not for love or even primarily for alliance, but for the preservation and enhancement of a bloodline understood to carry something essential to the right to rule. The result was a web of kinship so complex that by the high medieval period, virtually every ruling house in Europe was related to every other ruling house, and the question of who was most closely descended from which sacred ancestor was a matter of genuine political urgency. The Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks from the 5th to the 8th century of the Common Era, occupies a particularly prominent place in the popular literature around divine bloodlines and ancient lineages. The Merovingians were, even by the standards of medieval dynastic mythology, unusually insistent on the sacred character of their blood. The royal blood of the Merovingian line was called the long-haired kings. They were forbidden by tradition from cutting their hair, because it was in the hair that their power was believed to reside, a belief with obvious echoes of the Samson narrative from the Hebrew scriptures and of similar traditions found in various shamanic cultures. The Merovingian kings were believed to possess healing power, the royal touch, the ability to cure certain diseases simply by physical contact, a belief that persisted in modified form in the later French and English royal traditions down to the early modern period. The genealogical claims of the Merovingians went back, in their own tradition, to the Frankish founding myths, but popular and semi-scholarly traditions have connected them, through various chains of descent, to figures much further back in the historical and mythological record, ultimately, in the most ambitious versions of this narrative, to the Davidic royal line of ancient Israel, and through that line to the bloodline tradition of the ancient Near East that the biblical texts describe. These claims are not accepted by mainstream historical scholarship, which regards the genealogical chains required to support them as either entirely fabricated, or so poorly attested as to be useless as historical evidence. But they represent one of the most persistent and influential expressions of the divine bloodline idea in the Western tradition, and they continue to inspire a substantial body of popular literature that connects the Merovingians to everything from the Holy Grail legend to the modern persistence of art-negative blood in the European population. The Holy Grail tradition, which emerged in its literary form in the 12th and 13th centuries in the works of writers like Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach, has attracted more interpretive attention per page of source text than almost any other body of medieval literature. The Grail is described in different sources as a cup, a dish, a stone, a book, a vessel of some kind, but always as an object of supreme sacred significance, associated with the blood of the divine, in the Christian tradition, the blood of Christ, and accessible only to those who are of sufficient purity and worthiness to encounter it. The quest for the Grail, which forms the central narrative of the Arthurian tradition, is not merely an adventure story. It is a spiritual and genealogical quest, a search for the lineage that is pure enough, the blood that is close enough to the divine source to be worthy of the encounter, the identification of the Holy Grail with the bloodline rather than with the cup, the reading of the Grail as Sang Real, meaning royal blood rather than Holy Grail, is a modern interpretive tradition, most popularly associated with the 20th century book Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Begant, Lee and Lincoln, and subsequently absorbed into the even more widely read novel The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. In this reading, the Grail legend is a coded reference to the preservation of a sacred bloodline, the descendants of a union that the orthodox religious tradition denied, but that a secret tradition preserved and protected through the centuries. The bloodline in this interpretation carries something of the divine directly within it, not as a theological abstraction but as a literal biological inheritance, passed from parent to child through the mechanism of descent. Whether or not this interpretation has any historical foundation, it touches on exactly the same set of intuitions that animate the Rh-negative blood mystery in its popular form. The idea that there is a bloodline that carries something divine or semi-divine, that this bloodline has been preserved through history by conscious effort, that the carriers of this blood are in some sense different from the majority of humanity, and that this difference is written into the biology of the body rather than merely the theology of the mind. All of these ideas appear in both the Grail tradition and in the popular literature around Rh-negative blood, and the overlap is not coincidental. They are both expressions of the same deep human intuition, and they are both drawing on the same long tradition of thought about blood and lineage and the divine. The castle in the Grail legend, that idealized medieval fortress perched on its high rock, surrounded by the deep forest that tests the knights who approach it, is a metaphor for the place where the sacred blood is kept. It is inaccessible to the unworthy. It is visible only to those who are already in some sense of the right lineage, the right quality of attention, the right degree of readiness to recognize what they are seeing when they see it. The Fisher King who guards the Grail is wounded in a way that cannot be healed by ordinary means, and the land around him is a wasteland that reflects the injury of its king. Only the arrival of the right knight, carrying the right blood, asking the right question, can heal the king and restore the land. The question the knight must ask is, in some versions of the story, simply this: whom does the Grail serve? The answer is the key to everything, and it has to do with lineage, with the proper ordering of the sacred blood, with the recognition of what the blood carries and what obligations that carrying places on the carrier. You can hear in this story the same structure that appears in the Sumerian texts about the king, whose divine blood maintains the fertility of the land, and in the Egyptian tradition of the pharaoh whose health and the health of the Nile are one and the same thing, and in the Irish tradition of the sacred king whose rightness, whose correct relationship to the divine and to the land, is expressed in the flourishing of the crops and the peace of the kingdom. These are not coincidentally similar ideas. They are the same idea, expressed in different cultural idioms, preserved through different literary traditions, but ultimately rooted in the same ancient soil. The conviction that certain blood carries something that the land and the community need, and that the health of that blood and the health of everything around it are inseparable. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe, rising from the plains and hills of France and England and Germany, in those extraordinary centuries of architectural ambition, were themselves expressions of the blood theology in stone. They were built to honour a figure whose blood was understood to carry the full weight of the divine into the human world, and whose sacrifice of that blood was understood to have permanently altered the relationship between the human and the divine. The theology is specific to the Christian tradition, but the underlying structure, divine blood sacrificed for the benefit of the human community, transforming the world through the act of that sacrifice, is ancient beyond any specific religion. It appears in the Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, in the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, in the mystery religions of the Hellenistic world, and in indigenous traditions from every inhabited continent. Blood sacrifice as a cosmic event, as the mechanism by which the divine enters and transforms the human world, is one of the oldest ideas in human religious thought, and it is inseparable from the broader belief in the special character of certain blood. The interior of a great medieval cathedral, at the hour of the principal liturgy, would have been an overwhelming experience for the senses. The light falling through the stained glass windows, those extraordinary achievements of coloured and leaded glass that told the stories of the tradition in images rather than words, for the benefit of a largely illiterate congregation, would have transformed the interior into a landscape of coloured light, shifting with the movement of the sun outside, filling the space with something that was neither quite light nor quite colour, but a quality of both together that had no name in ordinary experience. The smell of incense and candle wax and the human bodies packed closely together in the nave, the sound of the chant rising into the vaulted ceiling, the distant figures of the priests at the altar performing the central ritual of the tradition. All of this would have combined to produce a state of heightened receptivity, an opening of the senses to something beyond the ordinary, that was precisely the intended effect of the whole elaborate construction. And at the centre of that ritual, at the altar in the distance, something was happening with blood. The wine was being transformed, in the theology of the tradition, into the blood of the divine. The same divine blood that the Grail legend sought, the same blood that the ancient kings of Sumer and Egypt and Israel claimed to carry in their veins, the same blood that the sons of God had mixed into the human stream in that brief and consequential passage in the 6th chapter of Genesis. The blood was being made present, made available, offered to the congregation as the most sacred thing the tradition possessed. And the congregation received it, with the reverence appropriate to receiving something that came from beyond the ordinary boundary of the human. The medieval mind would not have made the connection between the Eucharistic blood and the negative blood type in any explicit way, because the concept of blood type did not exist. But the underlying intuition that certain blood carries something different, something divine, something that the ordinary human body does not produce by its own resources, was as vivid and alive in the medieval congregation as it had been in the Temple of Ur or the Pyramid Complex of Giza. The forms were different, the specific narratives were different, the institutional frameworks that preserved and transmitted the belief were different, but the belief itself was the same, continuous, unbroken, carrying its conviction forward through the centuries as surely as the blood carried whatever was encoded within it through the generations. A generation after the high point of medieval cathedral building, the Black Death arrived in Europe and killed, within a few years, somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of the continent. The plague moved through the crowded cities and the connected rural communities with a speed and thoroughness that left no region untouched, and the theological crisis it produced was in many ways as devastating as the demographic one. A world organised around the conviction that the divine order was maintained and expressed through the hierarchies of blood and office, through the king's divine blood, through the priest's sacred lineage, through the complex web of hereditary obligation that the feudal system embodied, found itself confronted with a catastrophe that made no distinction between the highborn and the lowborn, the sacred and the secular, the long lineage and the recent upstart. The plague killed kings and bishops as readily as it killed farmers and servants. The blood of the ruling houses proved no more resistant to the disease than the blood of the peasantry. Whatever divine protection the sacred bloodlines were supposed to provide, it was not visible in the mortality statistics of the 14th century. And the crisis of faith that followed, the questioning of the old certainties about blood and lineage and divine protection, was one of the forces that drove the slow transformation of medieval Europe into the world of the Renaissance and eventually of the Enlightenment, in which the authority of blood would be progressively challenged by the authority of reason and the authority of the individual. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen uniformly. The blood theology persisted in attenuated forms long after the intellectual revolution that nominally replaced it. The divine right of kings was still being asserted in the 17th and 18th centuries, and was only definitively ended in Europe by the revolutions, the English, the American, the French, that replaced the authority of hereditary blood with the authority of constitutional law and popular consent. Even then, the residue of the old belief was not entirely cleared away. The royal families that survived the revolutionary period retained a symbolic authority that had nothing to do with their actual political power and everything to do with the persistent human intuition that there is something in certain blood that is different from the blood of ordinary people, something that we may not be able to name or explain, but that we continue, despite our modernity and our rationalism, to sense and to respond to. The old Berber woman in her mountain village in the Atlas, sitting in the doorway of her stone house in the late afternoon with the light going golden on the peaks above her, does not think about blood groups or antigens or evolutionary genetics. She thinks about her grandmother's grandmother, about the stories that were passed from one generation to the next in the particular form that her family kept them, about the knowledge of plants and their uses that has been in the family for as long as anyone can remember. She thinks about the quality that her granddaughter has shown from very early on, the ability to sense things before they happen, the unusual stillness in the presence of what others find frightening, the capacity for a particular kind of attention that the old woman recognizes because she has seen it before, in her own mother and in her mother's mother before that. She does not have a word for what the blood carries, but she knows that it carries something, and she knows that the knowing is itself a kind of knowledge, ancient and reliable and not in need of any laboratory confirmation to be true. The evening in the Atlas comes quickly, as it always does at altitude, the warmth draining from the air in the minutes after the sun drops behind the ridge. The old woman goes inside and lights the fire, and the smoke rises in thin blue columns through the opening in the roof, just as the smoke rose from 1,000 fires in 1,000 villages in these same mountains across all the centuries that have preceded this one. The knowledge passes, the blood passes, the mystery passes forward, one careful generation at a time. By the opening years of the 16th century, the world was in the process of a transformation more rapid and more comprehensive than anything it had experienced since the great migrations of the ancient past. The European encounter with the Americas, the rapid expansion of maritime trade routes that connected Europe to Africa and Asia in new ways, the Protestant Reformation that shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom, the beginnings of the scientific revolution that would eventually produce the tools needed to ask questions about blood that no previous era had been able to formulate. All of these were happening simultaneously, and the cumulative effect was to begin the process of destroying the old blood-based order and replacing it with something new. The scientific revolution, which gathered momentum through the 17th century and reached its first great synthesis in the work of Isaac Newton, was not primarily concerned with blood or lineage. It was concerned with the mathematical laws that govern the behavior of physical objects, with the mechanics of the solar system and the principles of optics and the mathematics of motion. But the habits of mind it established, the commitment to systematic observation, to the testing of hypotheses against evidence, to the willingness to revise belief when the evidence demanded it, were habits of mind that would eventually be brought to bear on the question of blood, and when they were, the results would be revolutionary in their own right. The 18th and early 19th centuries saw the first serious attempts to understand heredity in scientific terms. These early efforts were hampered by the absence of any knowledge of genetics at the molecular or even cellular level. The discovery of the cell as the basic unit of life, and the subsequent work on chromosomes and genes, lay in the future. But the observations were real, and the patterns they revealed were significant. Traits were inherited. Certain traits ran in certain families. The mechanisms were unknown, but the phenomena were undeniable. And the question of how the transmission of traits from parent to child worked, what the mechanism was by which the father's eye colour and the mother's nose shape, and the grandfather's musical ability appeared in the grandchildren, was one of the most pressing scientific questions of the era. Into this intellectual climate came Gregor Mendel, the Augustinian friar working in his monastery garden in Brno, whose patient experiments with pea plants in the 1860s laid the foundation of modern genetics. Mendel's laws of inheritance, his demonstration that traits were transmitted in discrete units that sorted independently and combined according to predictable mathematical ratios, were the beginning of the science that would eventually produce the understanding of blood type and the RH factor. Mendel himself did not live to see his work recognized, or to see its implications extended to human biology, but the patterns he identified in his pea plants were the same patterns that underlie the inheritance of every human blood type, including the RH factor. The years passed, and the science deepened, and the tools became more precise, and the questions became more specific. And in the early decades of the 20th century, in laboratories in Vienna and New York and London, the first clear scientific picture of blood type began to emerge, bringing with it the first clear scientific statement of a mystery that the ancient world had sensed for thousands of years without being able to articulate, that human blood was not uniform, that it came in distinct types, and that the distribution of those types across the human population carried a story that was still, in very large part, waiting to be read. The laboratory bench where Karl Landsteiner worked was, by the standards of what would come after, quite simple. Glass slides and pipettes and microscopes and the careful human eye, trained by years of practice to see what it needed to see in the behaviour of blood samples mixed together under controlled conditions. The results of his observations were clear and reproducible, and they changed medicine and, in a quieter way, changed the human self-understanding. But the full implications of what he had found, the full shape of the story that the blood type data was beginning to tell, would not become clear for many more years, and the chapter of that story that concerns us most directly, the chapter of the Rouge factor and its mysterious distribution and its persistent resistance to easy explanation, was still waiting to be written. The night deepens around you, and the questions rest quietly in the dark. There is no urgency to them. They have been patient for a very long time, and they can afford to remain patient a little longer, while the story moves toward the part where the modern tools of science begin to turn their full attention on the ancient mystery and find, in the data they generate, both answers and new questions in approximately equal measure. Rest easy in the stillness. The blood moves through you with its own quiet rhythm, carrying whatever it carries, patient and unhurried as it has always been. The 20th century arrived with a particular quality of confidence that no previous era had quite possessed. The tools of science had been refined to a degree that would have seemed almost miraculous to even the most sophisticated scholars of the previous century, and the pace of discovery was accelerating in ways that made each decade's knowledge feel almost quaint by the time the next decade arrived. Medicine, physics, chemistry, biology. All of these were producing insights and applications that were transforming the material conditions of human life at a rate that generated both genuine wonder and a perhaps premature certainty that the deep questions were close to being answered. The mysteries that had occupied human thought for millennia seemed, in the early decades of the century, to be yielding one by one to the patient application of the scientific method, and there was a sense in certain intellectual circles that the age of mystery was drawing to a close. It was in this atmosphere of expanding confidence that the discovery of the art factor arrived, quiet and almost unremarked in the broader cultural conversation, a small technical finding in a specialist medical journal that would take decades to reveal its full implications. The discovery came in stages, as most significant scientific discoveries do, through the work of several researchers building on each other's observations. Karl Landsteiner, already celebrated for his identification of the ABO blood group system, was working in New York by the late 1930s, collaborating with a younger researcher named Alexander Wiener on experiments involving the blood of rhesus monkeys. They found that when they injected rabbit and guinea pig immune systems with the blood of rhesus monkeys, the resulting antibodies would react not only with the monkey blood but with a significant proportion of human blood samples as well. This suggested that a substantial percentage of the human population carried an antigen on their red blood cells that was similar or identical to an antigen present in rhesus monkey blood. The antigen was named the Rh factor after the monkey, and the people who carried it were designated Rh positive. Those who lacked it were Rh negative. The initial work establishing the medical importance of this distinction came relatively quickly, as the connection between Rh incompatibility and the previously mysterious condition of hemolytic disease of the newborn was recognized and documented. Suddenly, a medical problem that had been observed for centuries without explanation, the tendency of certain women to suffer repeated stillbirths, or to produce infants who died within days of birth from a form of severe anemia, so was explained, and the explanation pointed directly at the Rh factor. The mechanism, once understood, was of a striking clarity. An Rh-negative woman carrying her first Rh-positive child rarely experienced problems because the immune response to the fetal blood antigens was not yet fully developed. But during delivery, when fetal blood cells could enter the maternal circulation, the mother's immune system learned to recognize the Rh-positive antigen as foreign and began to produce antibodies against it. In a subsequent pregnancy with another Rh-positive fetus, those antibodies could cross the placenta and attack the fetal red blood cells, causing the hemolytic disease that had killed so many infants across so many centuries, unnamed and unexplained, leaving grieving families to attribute the losses to divine will or to the malign influence of spirits, rather than to the specific molecular incompatibility of two different blood types meeting in the intimate space of the womb. The prevention of this condition, once the mechanism was understood, became one of the quiet triumphs of 20th century medicine. A treatment involving the administration of Rh immunoglobulin to Rh-negative mothers after delivery could prevent the sensitization that led to the dangerous antibody response, and the condition that had previously been a significant cause of infant mortality was brought largely under control within a few decades of the mechanism being understood. This is one of the most direct and practical consequences of the discovery of the Aurich factor, and it saved a very large number of lives. But the medical application was only one dimension of what the discovery of the Aurich factor revealed. The other dimension was the distributional question, the question of where Rh-negative blood was found in the human population and where it was not, and what the pattern of its distribution might mean. This question began to attract serious scientific attention in the decades following the initial discovery, and the answers that emerged were, to put it simply, surprising. Not in the sense that they violated any fundamental principle of genetics or population biology, but in the sense that the specific pattern they revealed, the high concentration in the Basque population, the elevated frequencies in the Atlantic Celtic populations and certain North African groups, the very low frequencies in East Asian and Sub-Saharan African populations, was sharper and more geographically specific than most researchers had expected. The Basque finding, in particular, drew sustained attention. When the first systematic blood typing surveys of European populations were conducted in the middle decades of the 20th century, the Basque results stood out immediately. In a continent where odd-negative frequencies range typically between 10 and 17% of the population, the Basque figures were consistently in the 30 to 40% range, roughly double the European average, and in some subpopulations even higher. The statistical significance of this divergence was impossible to ignore, and it stimulated a wave of research into the genetics and population history of the Basques that has continued to the present day. The research confirmed and extended what the linguistic and archaeological evidence had already suggested, that the Basques were a population of remarkable antiquity and remarkable genetic distinctiveness, representing the most intact surviving remnant of the pre-agricultural, pre-Indo-European population of Western Europe. Their genetic profile, including their Rh-negative frequency, appeared to reflect a very long period of relative reproductive isolation from the surrounding populations, during which their ancestral genetic characteristics were preserved, while the surrounding populations experienced the mixing that accompanied the Neolithic agricultural expansion, the Indo-European migrations, and the subsequent waves of historical migration that reshaped European genetics. The population geneticists who studied the Basques were, for the most part, satisfied with this account. It was scientifically coherent, consistent with the available evidence, and required no extraordinary assumptions. The Basques were old. Their population had been relatively isolated. Their genetic profile reflected that antiquity and isolation. The high Rh-negative frequency was a consequence of the same isolation that had preserved their language and their other distinctive genetic features. Case explained, in the broad strokes at least, even if the details continued to require further research. But for a significant number of people outside the specialist scientific community, this explanation felt incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily. The population genetics was not being disputed by the theorists who were most interested in the Rh-negative question, but insufficient. Because the question they were asking was not primarily a question about how a genetic trait had been preserved in an isolated population. It was a question about where the trait had originally come from, what it meant in the deepest sense, and why its distribution correlated so strikingly with the populations and the traditions most associated with the ancient mythology of divine bloodlines. The alternative theories that were developed in response to this sense of insufficiency ranged across a wide spectrum of plausibility and evidence. At one end of the spectrum were serious historical and anthropological arguments about the deep origins of the Atlantic European populations and their connections to prehistorical cultures whose nature and origin were not yet fully understood. At the other end were the more dramatic theories that drew on ancient astronaut traditions, on interpretations of the Sumerian and biblical texts as literal historical records of extraterrestrial contact, and on the idea that the Rh-negative trait was itself the biological marker of that contact, the genetic signature of the non-human ancestors who had mixed their blood with humanity's in the ancient past. Zecharia Sitchin, whose series of books beginning with the 12th Planet in 1976, proposed a detailed interpretation of Sumerian mythology as the historical record of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization he called the Anunnaki, provided the most developed and widely read version of the ancient astronaut theory as it applied to the origins of humanity. Sitchin argued, on the basis of his interpretations of Sumerian cuneiform texts, that the Anunnaki had come to Earth from a planet he called Nibiru in search of gold, had genetically engineered the human species from existing hominids, to serve as a labour force and had subsequently mixed their own genetic material with the human population they had created, producing a hybrid lineage that carried both human and Anunnaki genetic heritage. In Sitchin's framework, and in the popular elaborations of his ideas that followed, the O-negative blood type was the surviving biological evidence of this ancient genetic engineering. The original human beings created by the Anunnaki were, in this account, entirely Anunnaki in certain genetic respects, including their blood type. As the Anunnaki genetic material was diluted through subsequent generations of mixing with the broader human population, the O-negative trait became rarer, but it persisted in the populations that had maintained the closest connection to the original divine lineage: the Basques, the Atlantic Celts, the Berbers, and certain other populations whose histories connected them, in various ways, to the ancient civilizations of the Near East. The mainstream scientific response to Sitchin's work has been consistently negative. Scholars of ancient Mesopotamian languages have pointed out numerous errors in his translations and interpretations of the cuneiform texts, arguing that the picture he constructed was based as much on creative imagination as on accurate scholarship. Geneticists have noted that there is no evidence in the human genome for any non-terrestrial genetic contribution, and that the differences between Rh-positive and Rh-negative individuals are precisely the kind of differences that arise through normal mutation and genetic drift in isolated populations, without any need to invoke extraterrestrial intervention. These objections are serious and well-founded, and they cannot be dismissed by anyone who takes the standards of evidence seriously. The ancient astronaut theory, in the form that Sitchin and his successors developed it, does not hold up to rigorous scrutiny. The translations are not reliable. The genetic argument is not supported by the data. The history of the theory's development reveals more about the cultural anxieties and aspirations of its creators than about the actual history of the human genome. And yet the theory persists, and not merely among the credulous or the uneducated. It persists because it is, in its broad structure, asking a real question. The question of where the O-negative trait came from, why it is distributed the way it is, and what its persistence in the face of the selective pressure of hemolytic disease means. These are genuine scientific questions that do not yet have fully satisfying answers. The ancient astronaut theory provides the emotional satisfaction of a complete and dramatic narrative, and in the absence of an equally complete and dramatically satisfying scientific narrative, it fills a space that human beings find it difficult to leave empty. The difficulty of leaving mystery spaces empty is one of the most fundamental features of the human mind. We are, as a species, pattern seekers. We look for narrative in the arrangement of events. We look for intention behind the pattern of phenomena. We look for meaning in what might otherwise be merely the consequence of blind physical processes. This is not a weakness. It is the same cognitive tendency that made it possible for human beings to notice and record the patterns of the seasons, to develop agriculture, to build cities and write texts, and generate the accumulated knowledge that has made modern science possible. The same brain that produces conspiracy theories also produces cathedrals and symphonies and the equations of general relativity. The pattern seeking is the same. The patterns found differ enormously in their accuracy and their usefulness, but the seeking is constant and is itself a fundamental human good. The O-negative mystery in its popular form is a product of this pattern seeking operating on a genuine puzzle. The puzzle is real. The patterns are real. The distributional pattern in the blood type data, the structural patterns in the ancient mythologies, the historical patterns in the distribution of sacred bloodline beliefs. The interpretation of those patterns as evidence of extraterrestrial contact is not supported by the evidence in the way that the interpreters believe it is. But the patterns themselves are there, and they deserve serious attention, and the people who have devoted themselves to noticing them and connecting them, whatever the reliability of their conclusions, have performed a kind of service by insisting that the mystery not be too quickly closed. The laboratory where modern genetic analysis is performed looks nothing like the workbench where Landsteiner mixed his blood samples with his glass pipettes. It is a room of machines, of controlled temperature and humidity, of fluorescent lights, and the soft hum of centrifuges and sequencing instruments, of plastic tubes and reagents, and the quiet concentration of technicians who understand the molecular language in which the genome is written. The machines in this room can read the entire sequence of a human genome, all 3 billion base pairs of DNA that encode the instructions for building and operating a human body, in a matter of hours, generating a quantity of data that no single human mind can hold simultaneously, but that, analysed with the appropriate computational tools, reveals patterns of relationship and descent and variation that previous generations of scientists could only dream of accessing. The ancient DNA studies that have been conducted over the past 2 decades have transformed our understanding of human prehistory in ways that are genuinely revolutionary. By extracting and sequencing DNA from the bones and teeth of people who died thousands of years ago, researchers have been able to track the movements of ancient populations, identify the migrations and mixings that produced the genetic landscape of the modern world, and connect living people to their ancient ancestors with a precision that was previously impossible. The results have repeatedly surprised and sometimes overturned the models that were previously accepted on the basis of the more limited evidence available from modern population genetics and from archaeology alone. For the question of Rh-negative blood specifically, the ancient DNA studies have provided some important clarifications. They have confirmed that the high Rh-negative frequency in the Basque population is indeed associated with the persistence of ancient Western European genetic ancestry, and that this ancestry predates the Indo-European migrations that brought a predominantly positive genetic profile to most of the rest of Europe. They have illuminated the complex mixing of populations that took place in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, showing that the current distribution of blood types in Europe is the product of multiple waves of migration and mixing, each of which shifted the frequencies of various traits in the affected populations. But the ancient DNA studies have not yet provided a definitive answer to the deepest question, the question of the ultimate origin of the Rh-negative trait, of when and where the deletion that produces the Rh-negative phenotype first appeared in the human population, and whether there was a specific ancestral population from which all current Rh-negative carriers descend, or whether the same deletion arose independently in multiple populations at different times. The data needed to answer this question completely requires samples from populations that lived further back in time than the ancient DNA techniques can currently reach with confidence, and from regions of the world where the preservation conditions for ancient DNA are often poor. The estimates that have been made suggest that the Rh-negative deletion is relatively ancient in human terms, perhaps on the order of 30 to 40,000 years old, placing its origin in the period of the Upper Paleolithic when modern humans were expanding across Europe and the rest of the Old World. This timing would be consistent with the association of the trait with the ancient hunter-gatherer populations of Western Europe, and with the picture of a long Basque isolation preserving an ancient Western European genetic heritage. But the confidence intervals on these estimates are wide, and the question of a single origin versus multiple independent origins has not been definitively settled. What the genetic data does tell us, with considerable confidence, is that the Rh-negative deletion is entirely human in origin. There is no evidence of any non-human genetic contribution at the locus in question, or anywhere else in the human genome. The deletion is the kind of variant that arises spontaneously through normal mutational processes, and its spread through the ancestral Western European population is explicable through normal population genetic mechanisms, including the genetic drift that operates particularly strongly in small isolated populations. The science, in this respect, is clear, even if the full historical story of the trait's origin and spread remains to be told in complete detail. This clarity at the molecular level does not, of course, settle the question of meaning. Whether the Rh-negative trait has any significance beyond the purely medical, whether its carriers share characteristics that go beyond the blood type itself, whether the ancient mythologies of divine bloodlines are connected to it in any way that is more than coincidentally structural. These questions are not answered by the molecular data, and in some respects they cannot be answered by the molecular data alone, because they are questions about meaning and interpretation, as much as they are questions about mechanism and fact. The human being who receives the news of their own Rh-negative blood type and feels in that moment a particular quality of recognition, a sense that something they have always half known about themselves has been given a name and a context, is not experiencing a delusion. They may be misinterpreting the significance of what they have learned in ways that the science does not support, but the experience of recognition, of a piece of information resonating with something already present in the self, is real, and the question of what that resonance points to is one that pure molecular genetics is not equipped to answer. however thoroughly it can describe the molecular mechanism of the trait itself. The warm evening air in the high Basque country carries the smell of damp earth and oak leaves and wood smoke from the farmhouses scattered across the hillsides, and somewhere in the village below someone is playing an instrument in the old style, the notes falling through the still air with a quality of antiquity that is both specific to this place and somehow resonant with something much larger. The musician has played this tune before, many times, and heard it played many times before that, and behind the playing stretches a chain of similar evenings going back further than memory can reach, each one a thread in the long fabric of a life and a culture and a bloodline that has kept itself alive against considerable odds through all the centuries that have come and gone over these old hills. The mystery does not resolve itself in the playing of the music, but it is present in it, in the particular quality of the notes, in the way they fall and rise, in the specific emotional tone they carry that is recognizable to anyone from this culture, and somewhat mysterious to anyone from outside it. The blood carries whatever it carries. The music carries what the music carries. And the connection between them, invisible and unmeasurable but somehow present, is the thing that this story has been circling around from the beginning. A generation passed, and then another, and the science continued to deepen, and the mystery continued to refuse easy resolution, and the world continued to turn, one careful revolution at a time. The question of what it feels like to carry out negative blood, what the lived experience of being, in the biological sense, a member of this particular subset of the human population actually consists of, is one that the scientific literature does not address directly, because science, properly practiced, concerns itself with measurable phenomena and not with the quality of inner experience. But the people who carry this blood type have, in the age of the internet and the global conversation it has made possible, found each other in remarkable numbers, and what they report about their shared experience is itself a kind of data, imperfect and anecdotal and not amenable to the kind of statistical analysis that a geneticist would require, but real in the way that all human testimony about inner life is real. The reports cluster around certain themes with a consistency that is, at the very least, worth noticing. A heightened sensitivity to the emotional states of others, sometimes described as an almost physical sensation of absorbing the feelings of people nearby. A tendency toward what is variously called intuition, or precognition, or simply a quality of knowing things before the ordinary channels of information could have provided the knowledge. A sense of not quite belonging in the ordinary social world, of observing human behavior from a slight but persistent distance, as if watching a play in which one is also, imperfectly, a participant. An unusual relationship to authority, characterized by a difficulty in accepting hierarchies and conventions that seem arbitrary or unjustified, combined with a strong personal ethical framework that does not require external enforcement to remain operative, and perhaps most commonly reported, a sense of being somehow older than one's years, of carrying within the self a quality of experience or understanding that seems to exceed what the current lifetime could account for. These are the kinds of claims that are very difficult to evaluate scientifically. They do not map neatly onto any known genetic mechanism by which the presence or absence of the RHD antigen could produce the psychological and experiential characteristics described. The gene that encodes the RHD protein is not expressed in the brain, not involved in neurological development, not connected by any known pathway to the systems that regulate emotional sensitivity, or social perception, or the sense of personal identity. The traits described by Rh-negative self-reporters could, in principle, be explained entirely by the human tendency to find patterns and meanings that confirm a pre-existing narrative. If you know that you are Rh-negative and you have encountered the idea that Rh-negative people are more sensitive or intuitive, you may be more likely to notice and report the experiences that fit that description, and less likely to notice the experiences that do not. This is a real concern, and it is the kind of concern that any serious investigator of these claims must hold in mind. Confirmation bias is one of the most powerful and pervasive distortions in human cognition, and it operates most strongly precisely in the domain of self-perception and self-report. We see in ourselves what we expect to see, and we remember what confirms our self-image far more reliably than we remember what contradicts it. And yet, the consistency of the reports, across populations that are geographically separated and culturally distinct, Across individuals who encountered the R-negative mythology through different routes and at different stages of their lives is itself a phenomenon that demands some explanation. Whether the explanation is purely psychological, shared narrative producing shared self-perception, or whether there is some additional factor at work is a question that has not been seriously investigated by mainstream psychology or genetics, in part because the topic sits too close to the boundary between science and the kinds of claims that the scientific community is understandably reluctant to associate itself with. The boundary between what science currently accepts and what it currently does not accept is not, of course, a fixed or eternal line. The history of science is in considerable part a history of boundaries being moved, of phenomena that were once regarded as outside the scope of serious investigation being brought inside it, and of claims that were once treated as established being displaced by more accurate accounts. The movement of that boundary is slow and contested, and it proceeds not by consensus but by the accumulation of evidence that eventually becomes too substantial to ignore. Whether the claims made about arch-negative blood carriers will ever accumulate sufficient evidence to cross that boundary is impossible to predict. What can be said is that the territory in which those claims live, the territory of human consciousness, of the relationship between genetics and psychology, of the biological basis of spiritual and perceptual experience, is one of the most active frontiers of current scientific inquiry. The neuroscience of consciousness, the genetics of personality and temperament, the biology of social cognition and emotional sensitivity, all of these fields are producing new knowledge rapidly, and the picture of the relationship between the genome and the mind is becoming increasingly complex and increasingly surprising. In this context, the claim that blood type, including Rh factor, might be associated with certain psychological or perceptual tendencies is not inherently absurd, even if the current evidence for the claim is weak. It is a hypothesis that could in principle be tested, and the fact that it has not yet been rigorously tested says more about the priorities and the cultural assumptions of the scientific community than about the inherent implausibility of the question. The ancient world, which did not have the concept of genetics or the concept of blood type, but which had several thousand years of careful observation of human variation and heredity, arrived at conclusions about the relationship between lineage and psychological and spiritual capacity that were, in their own terms, quite specific and quite confident. The priestly castes of ancient India, the Brahmin families who maintained the Vedic knowledge, were not only expected to perform the rituals of the tradition, they were expected to embody a quality of perception and understanding that the tradition called Brahminical consciousness, a particular clarity and precision of mind, a particular quality of attention to the subtle levels of experience, that was understood to be developed and transmissible through the lineage. This was not a purely spiritual claim in the abstract sense. It was a claim about the interaction between birth, training, and the cultivation of specific capacities of consciousness, with birth, lineage, providing the necessary foundation on which training could build. The Vedic tradition is one of the oldest living intellectual traditions in the world, and its understanding of the relationship between consciousness and biology, while expressed in a vocabulary entirely different from that of modern neuroscience, reflects thousands of years of careful observation by people whose entire vocation was the study of the nature of mind and experience. The parallels between the Vedic account of lineage and consciousness and the popular accounts of negative blood and heightened perception are not direct or precise, but they belong to the same broad category of thought, the category that takes seriously the idea that what is in the blood, in the most literal biological sense, has something to do with what is in the mind and the spirit. In the forests of the Amazon basin, far from the libraries of ancient India, and far from the genetics laboratories of the modern West, the shamanic traditions of the indigenous peoples of South America have maintained, across an unknown but certainly very long period, a detailed and sophisticated understanding of the relationship between certain kinds of plants and certain kinds of consciousness. The shamans who work with these plants, who use specific botanical preparations to access states of awareness that are not available in ordinary waking consciousness, are, in virtually every tradition, people who are chosen for the role partly on the basis of descent. The shaman's gift, the capacity to navigate between the ordinary world and the other dimensions that shamanic practice opens, is understood to be a quality that runs in families, that is stronger in people who come from a lineage of shamans, and that can be cultivated in someone of the right descent by the appropriate training and initiation. whether this shamanic understanding reflects a genuine biological reality, whether there are in fact genetic factors that predispose certain individuals to certain kinds of perceptual experience, is a question that is beginning to attract serious scientific attention. The genetics of psychedelic experience, the heritability of spiritual and mystical states, the biological basis of the kind of thin boundary between ordinary and non-ordinary consciousness that characterizes the shamanic temperament. These are active research questions in the emerging fields of consciousness studies and psychedelic science, and the answers being generated, while still preliminary, suggest that the shamanic intuition about the heritability of certain capacities of consciousness is not without biological foundation. In this broader context, the claims made about Rh-negative blood and heightened sensitivity or unusual perceptual experience are part of a much larger conversation about the biology of consciousness and the relationship between genetic heritage and the quality of inner life. The specific claims about Rh-negative blood may or may not be supported by evidence when they are eventually rigorously investigated, but the underlying question, whether certain bloodlines carry in their biology a predisposition to certain kinds of experience, is a serious one, and the fact that it has been seriously asked in different idioms by peoples as diverse as the ancient Vedic scholars and the Amazonian shamans and the modern internet community of negative self-reporters suggests that it is touching something real about the human situation. The evening in the Amazon basin is a performance of sound. The transition from day to night is announced not by silence, but by the rising of a new set of voices. The insects and frogs and night birds that take over from the diurnal creatures as the light fades, building their chorus into the solid wall of sound that characterizes the equatorial night in the deepest forest. The shaman sitting at the edge of the village, preparing for the ceremony that will begin when the last light is gone, listens to the sound of the forest as he has listened to it since childhood, hearing in it the voices of beings that his tradition has taught him to recognize and communicate with. His knowledge of those beings, and of the protocols for approaching them, came to him through his teacher, who received it from his teacher before him, going back in a chain of transmission that the tradition does not try to trace to a specific beginning, because the beginning, in this framework, is before the beginning of human time. The preparation for the ceremony is itself a kind of meditation, a process of clearing the mind and the body of the ordinary concerns and distractions that would interfere with the quality of perception that the night's work requires. The shaman has fasted for a day. He has avoided certain foods and certain social contacts in the days leading up to this night. He has spent time alone in the forest, listening, opening his senses to the frequencies of experience that are present, but not ordinarily attended to. All of this preparation is understood by his tradition as the necessary clearing of channels that are more open in him than in most people, because he comes from a family in which these channels have been cultivated for generations, but that still require careful preparation and maintenance if they are to function with the clarity that the work demands. The fire at the centre of the clearing is lit as the last daylight fades, and the smoke rises in the thick evening air, and the ceremony begins with the same words that began it last time, and the time before that, and the time before that, going back through the chain of transmission to the original teacher whose name the tradition no longer remembers, but whose authority it still invokes. And in the smoke, and in the sound, and in the particular quality of attention that the shaman has cultivated through years of practice built on a foundation of lineage, something moves that is not easy to describe in the vocabulary of either ancient mythology or modern genetics, but that the people present in that clearing would not hesitate to call real. Back in the Northern Hemisphere, in the clean white spaces of the genetics laboratory, the sequencing machines continue their work, reading the genome with a thoroughness and a precision that previous generations could not have imagined. The researchers who work with these machines are, for the most part, careful and methodical people who are deeply committed to the standards of evidence that define their field, and who are appropriately skeptical of claims that exceed what the data can support. They are not, by and large, interested in the mythology of divine bloodlines or the popular theories about Rh-negative blood and ancient astronauts. They are interested in the mechanisms of genetic inheritance and population history, and in the specific questions about the Rh blood group system that remain to be answered within those frameworks. And within those frameworks, there are genuine remaining puzzles. The selective dynamics of the Rh-negative trait are not fully understood. The demographic history of the populations with the highest Rh-negative frequencies is still being worked out as new ancient DNA data becomes available. The relationship between the Rh blood group system and immune function, beyond the well-understood context of hemolytic disease of the newborn, has not been thoroughly investigated, and there may be associations with disease susceptibility or resistance that have not yet been characterized. The evolutionary question of why the trait has persisted at its current frequencies, despite the disadvantage imposed by Rh incompatibility in pregnancy, has not been definitively answered. These are real scientific questions, and they deserve real scientific investigation. The answers to them, when they come, will be expressed in the language of molecular biology and population genetics, not in the language of mythology or theology. But the answers will also, in their own way, be part of the long story that this narrative has been tracing, the story of what is carried in the blood and what it means and where it came from and where it is going. The ancient DNA revolution, which has been the most transformative development in the study of human prehistory in the past 2 decades, is not finished. Each year brings new samples, new analyses, new findings that revise and refine the picture of human population history. The coverage of the ancient world is still far from complete. Large regions and long periods remain unsampled, and the story of the global distribution of the Rh negative trait in prehistory cannot yet be told with the confidence that would satisfy a careful scientist. But the trend of the research is clear, and the picture that is emerging is one of deep antiquity and complex history, full of migrations and mixings and the preservation of old traits in isolated populations, and full of the kind of genuine surprise that characterizes the best scientific work. One of the most striking findings of the ancient DNA research has been the demonstration of continuity in certain populations that was not previously expected. The Basques, whose contemporary genetic distinctiveness was always acknowledged, have now been shown by ancient DNA analysis to be genuinely continuous with a specific ancient population. The early European farmers who arrived in Western Europe from Anatolia roughly 8,000 years ago, and who mixed with the existing hunter-gatherers of the region. The genetic profile of Neolithic farmers from sites in the Basque country and surrounding regions is remarkably similar to that of modern Basques, suggesting that despite the subsequent waves of migration that transformed the genetics of most of Europe, the Basque population maintained a degree of continuity with its Neolithic ancestors that is almost without parallel elsewhere on the continent. This is a finding of genuine scientific importance, and it deepens the mystery of the Basque people rather than resolving it. For if the Basques are the direct genetic descendants of the early European farmers, then the high Rh negative frequency that characterizes them was already present in that founding population, in the Neolithic farmers who came from Anatolia and who mixed with the Upper Paleolithic hunters of Western Europe. And the question of where the Rh negative trait was in that founding population leads back further still, to the populations of Anatolia and the Near East from which those early farmers descended, and to the deeper prehistory of the human presence in that region, which reaches back into periods and places that the ancient DNA tools can only partially illuminate. The land of Anatolia, the great peninsula that juts westward from Asia into the Mediterranean, was in the Neolithic period one of the most consequential places in human history. It was there, in the fertile highland zones of what is now southern Turkey, that some of the earliest experiments in agriculture took place, and the communities that developed the farming economy in that region were the ancestors of the waves of agricultural migration that spread farming and the genetic profile of the farmers across Europe and North Africa in the millennia that followed. If the Rh negative trait was already present in those founding Anatolian farming populations, then its origin lies even further back, in the populations of the Near East and the Caucasus and the Zagros foothills from which the Anatolian farmers themselves were descended. And if you follow that thread back far enough, through the Neolithic farmers to the Mesolithic hunters of the Near East, through them to the populations that came out of Africa and spread across the Old World in the great expansion of modern humans that began roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, you eventually arrive at the question of whether the Rh negative deletion arose once in a single ancestral population and was then carried outward by the migrations of that population's descendants, or whether it arose multiple times independently in different populations. This is the question of monophily versus polyphily in the technical language of genetics, and it has significant implications for the interpretation of everything that follows from it. The current evidence, while not entirely conclusive, tends to favour a single origin, or at most a small number of origins, for the primary negative deletion that defines the blood type in most populations. The specific genetic variant that produces Rho-negative blood in the majority of Rho-negative individuals worldwide appears to be the same variant, or a small set of closely related variants, which is what you would expect if the deletion had occurred once and been subsequently spread by population movement. The presence of the same deletion in populations as geographically separated as the Basques and the Berbers suggests either a common ancestral origin or, alternatively, an ancient contact between populations that subsequently became separated, which, given the history of human movement across the Mediterranean and between Europe and North Africa, is entirely consistent with the known patterns of prehistoric migration. The Berber connection is particularly interesting in this context. The Berbers of North Africa, as noted earlier, carry elevated Rh-negative frequencies relative to most African populations, and their genetic profile includes a substantial proportion of ancestry that came from Europe and the Near East, dating to the Neolithic and earlier periods. The ancient populations of North Africa were not geographically isolated from the populations of southern Europe. The Mediterranean is a sea, but it has been crossed by human beings since very early in the history of modern humans in the region, and the genetic evidence suggests a history of contact and mixing across the sea that goes back at least to the Mesolithic period. If the R-negative trait was present in the ancient populations of both the Atlantic coast of Europe and the coastal populations of North Africa, its origin may lie in a shared ancestral population that occupied some portion of the space between these two regions, perhaps in the Iberian Peninsula, which forms the geographic bridge between Europe and Africa, or perhaps in the population of what is now Morocco and southern Spain, which were connected by land during certain periods of low sea level in the deep prehistory of the region. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that is grounded in real geographic and genetic considerations, and it is the kind of hypothesis that the continuing expansion of ancient DNA research may eventually be able to test. The Mediterranean in the deep afternoon, viewed from the high ground above the Strait of Gibraltar, is a particular shade of blue that has no precise equivalent in any other body of water, a blue that is deep and clear and slightly luminous, as if the water were lit from within as well as from above. On the African shore, the Rif Mountains of northern Morocco descend to the water in a series of steep ridges, and on the European shore, the Rock of Gibraltar rises from the flat coastline of southern Spain in the dramatic mass that the ancient world called one of the Pillars of Hercules, the marker at the edge of the known Mediterranean world. Across this narrow water, human beings have been passing for as long as there have been human beings in the region, not always in boats. At various points in the deep past, the sea level was low enough that the strait was significantly narrower than it is today, and may at certain moments have been crossable without any watercraft at all. In the long history of that crossing, genetic material moved in both directions, and the traits carried by the people who made the passage became part of the heritage of the populations on both shores. Among those traits, the evidence suggests, was the R-negative deletion, moving northward and southward across the water with the people who carried it, entering new populations and persisting in them or being diluted, depending on the degree of subsequent mixing and isolation. This is the human story at its most elemental. People moving across the landscape, carrying their bodies and their knowledge and their blood from one place to another, mixing with the people they encounter, changing and being changed, leaving traces in the genetic record that modern science can read in the bones and teeth of individuals who died thousands of years ago and never imagined that their remains would one day be extracted from the earth and subjected to analysis by machines that would have seemed to them as supernatural as any of the gods they worshipped. The sense of wonder that this evokes, the sense that the past is not really past, that it is present in us in the most literal biological sense, encoded in the chemistry of our cells and readable by those who have learned the appropriate language, is one of the most powerful and most legitimate emotions that the R-negative mystery generates. Whatever the ultimate explanation of the mystery, whatever the actual origin of the trait, and whatever its actual significance for the psychology and spirituality of its carriers, the simple fact that we carry within us the genetic legacy of people who lived in a world so different from our own that it seems almost to belong to a different universe, that fact is remarkable enough to justify a very long and patient attention. The night grows deeper around you, and the breath slows, and the ancient world and the modern world settle into the same quiet darkness, separated by thousands of years but connected by the unbroken chain of blood that runs through every human body currently alive on this earth. Whatever you carry in your blood, whatever combination of ancient migrations and isolated populations and genetic drift, and the slow accumulation of variation across countless generations, has produced the specific chemistry of the person reading these words in this moment. It is old. It is very, very old, and it has survived things that would be impossible to imagine, carried forward through catastrophes and migrations and the slow grind of ordinary life across a span of time that the human mind is not really built to comprehend. That is, in itself, a thing worth resting with, a thing worth breathing slowly into in the soft dark of the late night, while the fan turns and the world outside is still, and the mystery continues to hold its ground against all the attempts that have been made to resolve it. Patient and ancient and entirely unhurried. Years passed, then decades, then centuries, and the thread continued. The royal bloodlines of medieval and early modern Europe present one of the most extensively documented cases of deliberate lineage preservation in the historical record, and they offer a perspective on the divine bloodline question that is simultaneously more grounded in verifiable historical fact and more genuinely strange in certain respects than the more dramatic theories that invoke ancient astronauts or supernatural beings. The strangeness arises not from any supernatural element, but from the simple observation that the people who maintained these bloodlines were, for many centuries, entirely serious in their belief that the blood itself carried something essential to the right to rule, and that this belief shaped the destinies of millions of people across many generations, in ways that are still visible in the political and cultural landscape of the modern world. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled over a continuously expanding collection of European territories from the late 13th century until the early 20th, is perhaps the most dramatic example of the consequences of sustained lineage management. The Habsburgs were, by the standards of even the most bloodline-conscious medieval dynasty, extraordinarily committed to the principle of keeping their blood within the family. Their marriage policies, which favoured unions between close relatives over successive generations, produced a genetic profile in the later members of the dynasty that was among the most inbred in the documented history of any ruling house. The famous Habsburg jaw, the pronounced lower jaw and underbite that became increasingly exaggerated in successive generations of the family, is one of the most visible expressions of the genetic consequences of this policy, and it has been studied by modern geneticists as a case study in the effects of consanguineous mating on the expression of certain heritable physical traits. The last Spanish Habsburg, King Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700, was by any measure a figure of profound and genuine tragedy. His inbreeding coefficient, the measure of the probability that he inherited identical copies of a gene from the same ancestral source, was higher than that of the offspring of a brother-sister union, despite the fact that no single generation of his ancestry involved a sibling marriage. The cumulative effect of generations of close relative marriages had produced by the time of Charles II a degree of genetic homozygosity that expressed itself in severe physical and cognitive disabilities, chronic ill health, and complete infertility. He died without an heir, bringing the Spanish Habsburg line to its end, and the succession crisis that followed contributed to a major European war that reshaped the political map of the continent. The lesson of the Habsburgs is not that the divine bloodline idea is simply wrong, but that the attempt to implement it through excessive consanguinity produces biological consequences that are the opposite of what the theory intends. If the theory is that certain blood carries something valuable, and that preserving the lineage preserves that valuable quality, then the Habsburg experience demonstrates that the mechanism of preservation must be more subtle than simple inbreeding, because inbreeding, taken to its logical extreme, destroys rather than enhances whatever the blood carries. The ancient traditions that counselled lineage preservation, the Egyptian royal marriages, the Brahmin caste system, the Druidic hereditary priesthood, maintained their bloodlines through endogamy within a defined group, not through the narrow inbreeding of a single family. The group was small enough to preserve the distinctive genetic heritage, but large enough to maintain the genetic diversity that biological health requires. This distinction between group endogamy and narrow inbreeding is one that the genetic science supports with considerable clarity. The populations that carry the highest Rh-negative frequencies, such as the Basques, maintain their genetic distinctiveness through endogamy, preferential mating within the group, over a very long period, but not through the kind of close relative mating that the Habsburgs practiced. The Basque population, though genetically isolated relative to neighbouring populations, was large enough and internally diverse enough to maintain the genetic health that the Habsburg line catastrophically lost. Their isolation preserved their ancient genetic heritage, including their elevated Rh-negative frequency, without producing the biological degradation that results from excessive consanguinity. The great royal courts of medieval Europe were in many ways the last institutional expressions of the ancient divine bloodline tradition in the Western world. The rituals of coronation, which invested the king or queen with the sacred authority of the bloodline through a ceremony involving anointing with holy oil, the presentation of the regalia of office, and the laying on of hands by the presiding clergy, were continuations, in Christianized form, of the ancient Near Eastern coronation rituals that had been performed in the palaces of Sumer and Akkad in Egypt for thousands of years before. The oil used in the anointing was itself a symbol of divine favour entering the royal body, marking the blood of the new ruler as something set apart from the blood of ordinary subjects. The crown, heavy with gold and gems, was a physical expression of the weight of the divine mandate carried in the royal lineage, and the throne, elevated above the rest of the court on its dais, placed the body of the royal bloodline at a physical height that expressed its metaphysical elevation above the merely human level. All of this ritual theatre was, at one level, a tool of political legitimation, a way of using the cultural authority of the sacred to reinforce the political authority of the ruler. But at a deeper level, it was a genuine expression of a genuine belief, held not only by the rulers who benefited from it, but by the overwhelming majority of the population that participated in it. The belief was not merely that the king was entitled to rule because the law said so, or because he was more powerful than his rivals, or because the church had endorsed his claim. The belief was that the king's blood was different, that something was in it that was not in the blood of ordinary people, that had been placed there by a higher power and maintained through the careful management of the royal lineage across many generations. Whether this belief was, in any sense, biologically accurate is a question that cannot be answered with the confidence that either the believers or the skeptics might wish. What can be said is that the belief was ancient, consistent, cross-cultural, and sustained over an enormous span of time by people who had every incentive to observe the natural world carefully, and whose observations of human heredity, however limited by the absence of genetic science, were grounded in long and patient watching of what was actually passed from one generation to the next. The Scottish Highlands in the late autumn are a landscape of severe and particular beauty. The hills brown and gold with the dying bracken, the sky a pale grey that contains within its neutrality a kind of brightness, the air sharp and clean with the smell of cold water and wet stone, and the distant salt smell of the sea coming in from the west. The great stone castles that punctuate this landscape were, in their time of building and inhabiting, the physical expressions of the same blood-based order that the medieval world maintained everywhere, but in the Highlands the expression was more personal, more direct, more openly rooted in the ancient Celtic tradition of the chief as the father of the clan, and the clan as a family defined by blood. The Highland clan system, which persisted in functional form until the military suppression that followed the Jacobite Rising of 1745, was one of the last living expressions of the ancient kinship-based social order in Western Europe. The clan chief was not merely a political leader or a military commander, though he was both of those things. He was the representative of the clan's lineage, the living embodiment of the blood that had defined the group since its founding, the person through whom the ancestral continuity of the community was expressed and maintained. His authority was not derived from any external grant or institutional appointment, though it might be confirmed by such things. It was derived from his blood, from the fact that he was of the direct descent of the original chief, or at least of the chiefly family, and that his blood therefore carried the quality of leadership and the connection to the ancestral territory that defined the clan's identity. The clan bards, who were trained in a long and rigorous tradition of poetic and historical composition, maintained the genealogies of the chiefly families with the same care that the Sumerian scribes had maintained the king lists of Sumer. They could recite the descent of the chief from the founding ancestor through every generation, naming each link in the chain, recording the alliances and the feuds and the marriages that had shaped the lineage across the centuries. This was not merely a literary exercise, it was a political and social document of the first importance, because the legitimacy of the chief's authority, and by extension the identity and the solidarity of the entire clan, depended on the accuracy and the completeness of the genealogical record. In the blood of the Highland clans, as in the blood of the Basques and the Berbers and the ancient priestly lineages of the Near East, the mystery persisted in its own particular form, not as a scientific question, not as a theological abstraction, but as a living practice, the daily reality of people who understood themselves to be defined by the blood they carried, who organised their social world around the recognition and preservation of that blood, and who would have found quite incomprehensible any attempt to reduce their identity to something other than the lineage from which they came. The Jacobite risings of the 18th century, which were the last military expressions of the blood-based dynastic politics of medieval Europe, ended in the blood of Culloden and in the systematic destruction of the Highland clan system that followed. The clan chiefs were stripped of their hereditary authority. The kilts and tartans that expressed clan identity were banned. The bards who maintained the genealogical traditions were dispersed or silenced, and the great diaspora of the Highland Scots that followed, across the Atlantic to the Americas, across the oceans to Australia and New Zealand and beyond, carried the blood of those ancient lineages into a new world where it mixed with the blood of every other tradition that had made its way to those new shores. The descendants of the Highland diaspora are now scattered across the world, from the Appalachian Mountains of the eastern United States to the pampas of Argentina to the sheep stations of southern Australia. They carry in their blood the same ancient Western European heritage that their ancestors carried, the pre-Indo-European substrate of the Atlantic populations, mixed with the Celtic and Norse and other subsequent contributions of Scottish genetic history. And among them, in somewhat higher frequencies than the global average, the Rh negative trait persists, moving through the generations with the quiet fidelity that genetic inheritance always maintains, regardless of what political upheavals or forced migrations may have disrupted the cultural framework that once gave the bloodline its social meaning. The disruption of that cultural framework, the destruction of the traditional structures that recognized and maintained the divine bloodline idea across so many cultures and so many centuries, is one of the defining features of the modern world. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, the rise of industrial capitalism and the urbanization that accompanied it, all of these contributed to the systematic dismantling of the old blood-based order and its replacement with a world organized around the principles of individual merit, legal equality, and rational governance. In this new world, the idea that certain blood carried something special was not merely politically inconvenient. It was theoretically incompatible with the foundational principles of the new order, and yet the idea did not disappear. It went underground, in the sense that it could no longer be openly expressed in the political and institutional forms that had previously given it its social power. But it persisted in the popular imagination, in folklore and mythology, and the vast literature of romance and legend that continued to celebrate the idea of the hero whose special blood marked him for a destiny beyond the ordinary. It persisted in the religious traditions that maintained, in various forms, the idea of a sacred lineage, the line of descent that ran from the divine through the human world and continued to carry something of the divine within it. And it persisted, in a new and increasingly popular form, in the alternative history and conspiracy theory traditions that emerged in the late 20th century, and that brought the divine bloodline idea into contact with the entirely new phenomenon of the internet-connected global conversation. The internet changed the Rh-negative discussion in ways that no previous development had. Before the internet, the people who were interested in the mystery of Rh-negative blood and its possible connection to ancient bloodlines were isolated individuals or small groups, reading books that reached limited audiences and conducting their investigations largely in private. The connection between geographically separated people who shared an interest in the same questions was slow and difficult, and the feedback loops that amplify ideas and build communities of belief were correspondingly slow. The internet collapsed those distances and accelerated those feedback loops to an extraordinary degree, and within a relatively short period of time, what had been a scattered collection of isolated researchers and curious individuals became a global community of conversation and investigation, connected by a shared interest in the same questions and able to exchange observations and theories and personal experiences with a speed and a breadth that previous generations could not have imagined. The result was an explosion of attention to the art-negative question, producing an enormous body of online content, articles, videos, forums, social media groups that range from careful and well-sourced historical research to the most dramatic and unsupported speculation, with every possible intermediate position represented. The community that gathered around the topic was similarly diverse, including professional researchers and amateur historians, people with Rh-negative blood who are trying to understand themselves and people without it, who are fascinated by the mystery, serious skeptics and committed believers, and the great majority who occupied the uncertain space between those poles. What emerged from this explosion of attention was not a consensus or a resolution of the mystery, but something perhaps more interesting, a collective mapping of the territory of the question, an articulation of the full range of things that the Rh-negative data and the ancient mythologies and the personal experiences of carriers could be made to say when they were brought into contact with each other. The mapping was imperfect and inconsistent and often inaccurate in its details, but it had the quality of genuine inquiry, the quality of a large number of minds, of varying degrees of sophistication and rigour, genuinely trying to understand something that matters to them. Among the more careful and historically grounded contributions to this conversation, certain themes emerged with particular consistency and with some genuine analytical substance. The connection between Rh-negative blood and the Basque people, with their linguistic isolation and their ancient genetic distinctiveness, was consistently identified as the most significant and most puzzling single data point in the whole discussion. The structural similarities between the ancient mythologies of divine bloodlines across different cultures were carefully documented and analysed. The medical anomaly of Rh incompatibility, the immune system's treatment of the Rh-positive fetus as foreign, was repeatedly pointed to as a biological phenomenon that, whatever its medical explanation, carried the quality of a memory, an echo of some ancient incompatibility between two different biological types. These are the threads that run through the most thoughtful versions of the Art-negative discussion, and they are worth holding together in the mind as the story moves toward its final chapters. Not because they lead to a definitive conclusion, they do not, and any account that claims they do is probably not being honest with itself or with its audience, but because the questions they represent are real questions, and the mystery they point to is a real mystery, and the human need to understand what is carried in the blood, what the ancient world called the bloodline, and what the modern world calls genetics, and what the people in between called the sacred inheritance, is a real need, ancient and persistent and entirely understandable. The stars above the Basque Hills tonight are the same stars that the ancient stone builders of the Atlantic coast used to align their monuments, the same stars that the Sumerian astronomers tracked with their clay tablets, the same stars that the Highland bards sang about in their genealogical poems. They have not moved, relative to each other, in any way that the naked eye can detect across the span of human civilization. They are fixed, or nearly so, in their ancient positions, and the patterns they make in the sky are the same patterns that every generation of sky watchers before us has looked up and seen and tried to read for meaning. And somewhere under those stars, in the blood of the living, the old mystery continues its patient forward movement, carrying whatever it carries, waiting for the moment when the understanding catches up to the reality it is trying to describe. The modern genetics laboratory, as noted earlier, is a place of precision and patience, where the questions that were once the province of mythology and theology are being asked in a new language with new tools and with new standards of evidence that previous eras could not have imagined. But the most significant development in the genetics of human prehistory in the past 2 decades is not, in fact, the sequencing of living genomes. It is the recovery and analysis of ancient DNA from the bones and teeth of people who died thousands of years ago. And it is this body of work, accumulating with remarkable speed in the journals of human genetics and ancient genomics, that has most directly challenged and refined the existing understanding of where Rh-negative blood comes from and what its distribution means. The ancient DNA revolution began in earnest in the 1980s and 1990s, when researchers first demonstrated that it was possible to extract DNA from archaeological specimens and amplify it using the polymerase chain reaction technique that had itself been developed only a few years earlier. The early work was hampered by contamination problems and by the limitations of the sequencing technology available at the time, and many of the earliest claims about ancient DNA turned out, on closer examination, to be artifacts of contamination rather than genuine ancient sequences. But the methodological problems were gradually solved, the technology improved at a rate that seemed almost impossibly rapid, and by the 2010s the field had reached a level of reliability and productivity that has made it one of the most exciting and productive areas of biological research. The findings of the ancient DNA studies have been, as noted, genuinely transformative for the understanding of European prehistory. But their implications for the Ig-negative question specifically deserve closer examination, because the picture that emerges from the ancient DNA data is both more complex and more interesting than either the mainstream genetic account or the popular theories had previously suggested. The key finding, which has been confirmed by multiple independent studies using samples from sites across Europe, is that the genetic landscape of prehistoric Europe was shaped by at least 3 distinct major migrations, each of which contributed a different ancestral component to the modern European population. The first component is the ancestry of the original hunter-gatherers who inhabited Europe before the advent of agriculture, descendants of the people who entered Europe from the east roughly 45,000 years ago, and who spread across the continent during the long millennia of the Upper Paleolithic. The second component is the ancestry of the early farmers who migrated into Europe from Anatolia, beginning roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, bringing with them the agricultural economy and the genetic profile of the Near Eastern farming populations from which they descended. The third component is the ancestry of the steppe populations, the Yamnaya and related groups, who migrated into Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe beginning roughly 5,000 years ago, bringing the Indo-European languages and a genetic profile that included a substantial contribution from ancient populations of the Caucasus and the Eastern steppe. The Ig-negative deletion, as far as the ancient DNA studies have been able to determine, was present in both the European hunter-gatherer populations and in the early Anatolian farmers, though in what proportions in each group is not yet fully established. It was notably less common, or perhaps absent, in the incoming steppe populations, which is consistent with the observation that modern populations with the highest steppe ancestry have the lowest Ig-negative frequencies, and populations with the highest Anatolian or hunter-gatherer ancestry tend to have the highest Ig-negative frequencies. This finding reinforces the picture of the Ig-negative trait as an ancient Western Eurasian characteristic, shared between the European hunter-gatherers and the early Anatolian farmers, and diluted in subsequent European populations by the admixture of steppe ancestry. The Basques, who show the lowest steppe ancestry of any modern European population, and the highest combined hunter-gatherer and Anatolian farmer ancestry, accordingly show the highest Ig-negative frequency. The pattern fits the model with a coherence that is scientifically satisfying, even if it does not resolve the deeper question of why the trait was so prevalent in those ancient Western Eurasian populations in the first place. The Anatolian connection is particularly intriguing when considered in the context of the ancient Near Eastern mythologies that have featured so prominently in the popular discussion of divine bloodlines. Anatolia was not only the source of the early European farmers, it was also a region with deep and complex connections to the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Levant, the civilizations that produced the Sumerian creation myths, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Akkadian accounts of the Anunnaki, and the precursors of the Hebrew narratives about the sons of God and the Nephilim. The population movements of the Neolithic period connected Anatolia to both the east, through trade and cultural exchange with the emerging urban civilizations of Mesopotamia, and to the west through the agricultural migrations that carried Anatolian farmers into Europe. If the Ig-negative trait was prevalent in the Anatolian farming populations, and if those populations were themselves in cultural and possibly genetic contact with the populations of ancient Mesopotamia, then there is at least a structural possibility that the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, the creators of the divine bloodline mythology, were aware of, and perhaps specifically associated their mythology with, a physical characteristic that was more common in certain lineages than in others. This is not evidence for any specific theory about the origin of the trait or the meaning of the mythology, but it is a connection worth noting, and it belongs to the territory of genuine historical speculation, the kind of speculation that is grounded in real data and real geographic relationships, even if it reaches beyond what the data can currently confirm. The ancient city of Çatalhöyük, which flourished in the Konya plain of central Anatolia roughly 9,000 years ago, is one of the most remarkable and most studied archaeological sites in the world. It was, at its peak, one of the largest human settlements in existence anywhere on Earth, a dense agglomeration of mud brick houses built directly against each other without streets between them, so that the inhabitants entered their homes through openings in the roof and moved through the settlement across the rooftops. Inside the houses, the walls were decorated with elaborate paintings, with the skulls of wild bulls plastered into the walls as objects of what appears to have been ritual significance, with the bodies of the dead buried beneath the floors of the houses in which they had lived. The people of Çatalhöyük were farmers and herders who also hunted, and the DNA of their descendants contributed substantially to the ancestry of the early European farmers, who subsequently carried the agricultural economy westward across Europe. If the Och negative deletion was already present in the population of Çatalhöyük and similar sites, which the general pattern of the ancient DNA data suggests is at least possible, then its origin in the Western Eurasian lineage reaches back to those early settled communities, with their painted walls and their bull skulls and their ancestors buried beneath their feet, people whose lives were organised around the same central human concerns that have always organised human life, but whose specific expressions of those concerns were sometimes startlingly different from anything that came after. The painted walls of Çatalhöyük, reproduced in the standard references of Neolithic archaeology, show animals and abstract patterns and occasionally human figures engaged in activities that have resisted definitive interpretation. They are old enough, and different enough from any subsequent artistic tradition, to present a genuine challenge to the interpretive frameworks that scholars bring to them. The people who painted them were doing something meaningful, something connected to their beliefs and their understanding of the world, but what exactly they were doing is a question that remains open, available to imagination in the absence of any written record of their intentions. In the absence of written record, the blood speaks, not in words, but in the pattern of its distribution across the living descendants of those ancient painters, and in the medical and genetic facts that modern science has been able to establish about the trait they carried. It is a form of communication across enormous distances of time, and it requires a particular kind of listening, patient, humble, willing to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously without forcing a premature resolution. The Mediterranean world of the second millennium before the Common Era was a world of remarkable interconnection, a network of trade and cultural exchange that linked the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Aegean in a web of mutual influence that was more dense and more sophisticated than the popular image of isolated ancient civilization suggests. The late Bronze Age palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the Egyptian New Kingdom, the city-states of the Levantine coast, were in regular and intensive contact with each other, exchanging not only goods, but ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and the people who carried them. In this interconnected world, the bloodline traditions of different cultures were certainly in contact with each other. Egyptian priests and Mesopotamian scholars and Levantine merchants who met in the cosmopolitan port cities of the Levantine coast would have known, in broad outline, the sacred narratives of each other's traditions. The structural similarities between the Egyptian account of divine kingship and the Mesopotamian account of the divine king, between the Hebrew narrative of the covenant lineage and the Egyptian narrative of the pharaonic bloodline, are in part the result of this contact, of ideas moving through the network of late Bronze Age exchange and finding their way into the traditions of communities that then adapted and expressed them in their own cultural idiom. The collapse of the late Bronze Age, which occurred with striking speed and thoroughness around 1200 before the Common Era, was one of the most dramatic civilizational catastrophes in ancient history. Within a period of roughly 50 years, the palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost simultaneously. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece were destroyed, the Hittite Empire fell, the major cities of the Levantine coast were burned, and Egypt was severely weakened, surviving but significantly reduced. The causes of this collapse are still debated by historians, with proposed explanations including invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, climatic disruption, internal rebellions, the disruption of trade networks, and various combinations of all of these factors. What the collapse meant for the bloodline traditions of the region was a significant disruption of the institutional structures that had maintained and transmitted those traditions. The palace scribes who kept the genealogical records, the temple priests who performed the rituals that confirmed the divine character of the royal blood, the networks of trade and communication that had connected the different expressions of the tradition across the Mediterranean world. All of these were damaged or destroyed by the Bronze Age collapse, and the recovery that followed was incomplete. The world that emerged from the collapse was different from the world that had preceded it, and the bloodline traditions that survived did so in modified and sometimes fragmentary forms, preserved in the written records that had been compiled before the catastrophe, or in the oral traditions of communities that maintained them without institutional support. The Hebrew tradition, which produced the biblical texts, was shaped in part by the experience of living in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, and in the shadow of the great empires that succeeded it: Assyria, Babylon, Persia. The specific form in which the divine bloodline idea appears in the Hebrew texts, the covenant lineage of Abraham, the priestly descent of Aaron, the royal descent of David, reflects both the ancient Near Eastern background from which the tradition emerged and the specific historical experiences of the community that produced the texts. The insistence on the uniqueness of the Hebrew covenant, on the specific and exclusive character of the lineage chosen by the divine for a special relationship, is in part a response to the pressure of living among great empires with their own divine bloodline claims, a way of asserting a distinct identity and a distinct connection to the sacred in the face of those claims. The morning in ancient Babylon, in the days when the great city was at the height of its power and the empire of Nebuchadnezzar stretched across the Near East, would have begun with the sound of the city coming to life, the market vendors setting up their stalls in the long avenues near the Ishtar Gate, the smell of bread baking in the communal ovens, the braying of donkeys being loaded with goods for the day's trade, the distant chanting of the priests in the great temple of Marduk beginning the day's ritual sequence that would continue until nightfall. The city was enormous by the standards of its time, its population estimated by modern scholars at perhaps 200,000 people, and its streets were full of the mixture of languages and faces that a great imperial capital always produces. Babylonians and Assyrians and Arameans and Egyptians and, after the conquest of Jerusalem, Hebrew exiles who brought with them their own traditions and their own understanding of what divine blood meant and where it could be found. The Hebrew exiles in Babylon maintained their traditions with remarkable tenacity in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate into the dominant culture. It was in this period, according to most modern biblical scholarship, that many of the Hebrew texts were compiled, edited, and given the form in which they have been preserved. The experience of exile, of being a small community defined by a particular covenant lineage, living among a vastly larger population with different bloodline claims and different divine allegiances, sharpened the Hebrew awareness of lineage and descent, and made the careful maintenance of genealogical records a matter of urgent communal necessity. You had to know who you were and where you came from, because in the world of Babylon, if you did not know, no one else would care. This same sharpened awareness of the importance of lineage in a world that does not automatically recognize or honor it is one of the things that the modern Rh negative community, in its own very different historical context, seems to share with those ancient exiles. The sense of being a minority within the larger human population, of carrying something that the majority does not carry, and that is not automatically recognized or valued by the majority culture, of needing to seek out others who share the same heritage in order to understand and maintain it. These are experiences that recur across very different historical and cultural contexts, and they suggest that the feeling of being defined by a bloodline that sets one apart is not merely an artifact of mythology or a projection of personal psychology, but a genuine feature of the experience of certain kinds of difference that is old enough and consistent enough to be taken seriously. The question of what that difference consists of at the biological level is one that the science is still in the process of answering. The association between blood type and disease susceptibility has been a productive area of research, and the findings have confirmed that the different blood group systems, ABO, Rh and the many others that are less well known outside specialist medical circles, do have measurable associations with the risk of certain diseases. People with type O blood, for example, have a somewhat lower risk of certain cardiovascular diseases, but a somewhat higher risk of certain ulcer-related conditions. People with certain Rh variants have been found to have different susceptibility profiles for some parasitic and infectious diseases. These associations are real, though their effect sizes are generally modest, and they suggest that the blood group systems are not merely neutral genetic markers, but carry functional significance for the immune system and its interactions with the microbial world. Whether the US-negative trait specifically is associated with any functional differences that extend beyond the immune context, whether it's associated with any neurological or psychological differences that might underlie the reports of heightened sensitivity and unusual perceptual experience made by Rh-negative self-reporters, is a question that has not been rigorously investigated. It is possible that such associations exist and have simply not been studied because the combination of the relatively small effect sizes that would be expected and the cultural sensitivity of the topic has discouraged systematic research. It is also possible that the associations reported by self-identifiers are entirely the product of confirmation bias and have no biological basis. Without the research, it is not possible to say. What can be said is that the relationship between the genome and the brain, and between the brain and the quality of subjective experience, is far more complex and far more intimate than the simple models of previous decades suggested. The emerging field of nutrigenomics has shown that genetic variants can affect how the brain processes information about the body's nutritional state in ways that influence mood and cognition. The genetics of the immune system have been found to influence the brain's development and function through pathways that were not previously recognized. The microbiome, the community of microorganisms that lives in the human gut and that is influenced in part by blood-type antigens expressed on the surface of gut cells, has been shown to have substantial effects on brain function and mood through what researchers call the gut-brain axis. The blood-type antigens, including the archantigens, are expressed not only on red blood cells, but on a variety of other tissues throughout the body, including the cells lining the digestive tract, certain types of immune cells, and possibly cells of the nervous system itself. The full functional significance of this widespread expression is not yet understood, and it is at least biologically plausible that the presence or absence of certain blood group antigens in these various tissue contexts could have effects on physiology and indirectly on the quality of experience that go beyond the immune function that is currently the primary focus of blood group research. This is speculative, and it should be clearly identified as speculative. But it is speculative in a direction that is pointed at by real, biological considerations, not merely by the desire to find a mechanism that would confirm a pre-existing belief. The biology of blood type is more complex and more pervasive than most people, including most physicians, appreciate, and the investigation of that complexity is still in its early stages. Whatever is ultimately found when the investigation is more complete, the finding will be interesting, and it will add to the long and layered story of what blood carries and what that carrying means. The River Jordan, in the season when the winter rains have filled it, and the water runs fast and dark between its banks of tamarisk and willow, is a river of modest physical dimensions that carries an enormous weight of human meaning. More religious history and more theological significance have been associated with its relatively short course than with rivers 10 times its length, because the communities that have lived along it and crossed it and been baptized in it and dreamed of it in exile have invested it with the full weight of their understanding of what it means to be chosen, to carry a covenant, to bear in the body the mark of a relationship with the divine. The water of the Jordan carries minerals and sediment from the highland springs and the watershed of the Sea of Galilee, and when it reaches the Dead Sea, that extraordinary body of water so saturated with salt that nothing lives in it and nothing sinks in it, it disappears into the evaporation that the desert heat produces, leaving its mineral load behind to concentrate in the increasingly salty water of the shrinking lake. The blood carried by the people who have lived along its banks over the millennia has dispersed far more widely than the water, carried to every corner of the world by diaspora and migration and the complex movements of peoples across the face of the earth, but it has left traces in the genetic record of living populations that can be read by those who know how to look. Among those traces, the distribution of blood types, including the art factor, carries information about the movements and the mixings of ancient populations that is slowly being decoded by the ancient DNA researchers and the population geneticists who have devoted their careers to this question. The full story is not yet told, and it may be that some parts of it will never be told with the precision that a complete account would require. But what is being told, piece by piece and year by year, is already remarkable enough to justify the patient attention that the mystery has always required. The night is very deep now, and the questions have settled into a kind of companionable quiet, no longer pressing for immediate answers but simply present, as the oldest questions always are, in the background of consciousness where they have always lived. The fan turns its soft circle, the breath comes and goes. The ancient world and the modern world share the same darkness, separated only by the thin membrane of time, and the blood moves through the living with the same quiet fidelity with which it has always moved, carrying forward whatever it carries, one heartbeat at a time. A generation passed, and the mystery deepened rather than resolved, and the story moved toward whatever it was moving toward, one patient step at a time. Continue. The legacy of O-negative blood in the human story is not a single thread, but a braid. Multiple strands twisted together, each one distinct, each one contributing to the strength and the complexity of the whole. There is the strand of pure genetics, the molecular biology of the RD deletion, and its distribution across living and ancient populations. There is the strand of ancient mythology, the consistent cross-cultural belief in divine bloodlines, and the mixing of human and non-human origins. There is the strand of medical history, the long, unrecognized tragedy of hemolytic disease, and the eventual understanding that resolved it. There is the strand of popular imagination, the 20th and 21st century elaboration of the mystery into theories of ancient astronauts and royal conspiracies and hidden lineages. And there is the strand of personal experience, the testimony of the people who carry this blood type and who describe, in their own words and in their own terms, what it feels like to be, in this particular biological sense, different. None of these strands, taken alone, tells the complete story. Each one illuminates a portion of the mystery and leaves other portions in shadow. The complete account requires holding all of them together, moving between them with the kind of patient attention that does not force a premature resolution, that is willing to sit with uncertainty, and with the particular discomfort of a question that does not yet have a fully satisfying answer. The strand of genetics tells us that the RUT-negative trait is ancient in the Western Eurasian lineage, that it is most concentrated in populations of greatest genetic antiquity in that region, and that its persistence despite the selective pressure of hemolytic disease represents an evolutionary puzzle that has not been fully resolved. It tells us that the trait is entirely human in origin, the product of a specific deletion that occurred at some point in the Upper Paleolithic or earlier, and was subsequently spread by the movements of the populations that carried it. It tells us that the people who carry the highest frequencies of the trait are also, in many cases, the people who are most directly descended from the oldest layers of the Western Eurasian population, before the great migrations of the Neolithic and Bronze Age transformed the genetic landscape of Europe and the Near East. The strand of ancient mythology tells us that virtually every civilization that has left a written or oral record has included among its most important and most carefully preserved beliefs the idea that certain lineages carry something divine, that the mixing of human and divine or human and non-human origins produced a special bloodline, and that the preservation of that bloodline was a matter of the highest sacred significance. It tells us that this belief appears in forms that are structurally similar across cultures that had no known contact with each other, which suggests that it is not merely a cultural invention that spread from one source, but a genuine and repeated observation that arose independently in multiple places because it reflected something real about human experience. It tells us that the populations in which the O-negative trait is most concentrated are, in many cases, the populations in which the divine bloodline mythology is most vividly preserved. The Basques, with their extraordinary antiquity, the Atlantic Celts with their myths of the Tuatha de Danann and the Grail tradition, the Berbers with their ancient North African heritage, the communities of the ancient Near East that produced the texts about the Anunnaki and the Nephilim and the covenant lineage of Abraham. The strand of medical history tells us that the arch factor was discovered in the context of solving a specific medical problem, the unexplained deaths of infants born to mothers whose immune systems attacked their blood, and that the solution to that problem was one of the genuine triumphs of 20th century medicine. It also tells us that the biological mechanism of Rh incompatibility is, from an evolutionary perspective, anomalous. That a blood type whose carriers' pregnancies are endangered by the mixing with the more common blood type should not persist in the population at current frequencies, and that the persistence of the trait therefore requires some form of explanation that goes beyond the simple dynamics of natural selection against a harmful trait. The strand of popular imagination tells us that the human need to understand the mystery of blood and lineage is undiminished by the advent of genetic science, that the questions the ancient world asked in the language of myth and theology are still being asked in the modern world in the language of alternative history and popular science and internet communities, and that the emotional resonance of the divine bloodline idea is as powerful today as it was when the priests of Ur climbed their ziggurat steps and the bards of the Highland clans recited their genealogies by firelight. It tells us that the desire to understand oneself in terms of a heritage that is ancient and special and connected to something beyond the ordinary human stream is not a primitive superstition that modern education has dissolved, but a deep and persistent feature of human consciousness that no amount of molecular biology has yet made unnecessary. And the strand of personal experience tells us that the people who carry this blood type, whatever the biological mechanism, whatever the ultimate explanation of the mystery, describe their lives in terms that recur with a consistency that demands some form of serious attention, the heightened sensitivity, the sense of ancient familiarity, the quality of knowing that exceeds what the ordinary channels of information could have produced, the feeling of being slightly outside the ordinary current of social life, observing from a small but persistent distance. These are reports that may be entirely explicable by psychology and confirmation bias and the human tendency to find meaning in coincidence. But they may also be pointing at something real that the current tools of science have not yet been calibrated to measure. The full braiding of these strands produces something that is neither the simple genetic story nor the dramatic mythology, but something more interesting than either, a genuine mystery, in the old sense of the word, meaning not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a depth that rewards sustained contemplation without ever being fully exhausted by it. The mystery of R-negative blood is a genuine mystery in this sense, and it deserves to be treated as one rather than being either dismissed as superstition or inflated into a complete cosmological theory. What the legacy of this blood type looks like in the modern world is, in many respects, the legacy of all ancient things that have survived into a world that was not designed to accommodate them. The Basque language, still spoken by several 100,000 people in its mountain homeland, is the surviving voice of a pre-Indo-European Europe that was otherwise completely absorbed or displaced by the great migrations of the ancient past. The megalithic monuments of the Atlantic coast, still standing in their alignments after 5,000 years, are the surviving physical expressions of a cosmological vision that the subsequent civilizations of Europe did not inherit and did not fully understand. And the OS-negative blood type, still present in significant frequencies in the populations most directly descended from the ancient Western Eurasian substrate, is the surviving biological expression of a genetic heritage whose full significance has not yet been determined. All of these survivals share a quality that might be called the patience of the ancient. They do not insist on being noticed. They do not explain themselves in any language that the modern world finds immediately accessible. They simply persist, carrying whatever they carry, occupying their space in the landscape of the present with the quiet confidence of things that have already survived many ages and many changes, and that have learned, if things can be said to learn, that the next age will come and go as all the previous ages have, and that what is essential will continue to be present in the world regardless. The Basque farmer who works the same terraced fields that his ancestors worked, in the same hills where those ancestors built the same kind of stone walls and herded the same kind of hardy mountain sheep, carries in his body the genetic heritage of people who were already ancient when the Roman legions first entered his homeland. He may know nothing of the Och factor, he may have no interest in the mythology of divine bloodlines, or the popular theories that connect his blood type to ancient astronauts or sacred lineages. What he knows is the land, and the work, and the specific quality of the morning light on the hills, and the language that his grandparents spoke and that he speaks to his children. And in the blood that moves through him as he works, the ancient mystery persists, patient and unhurried and indifferent to whether it is understood. The molecular biologist who studies the RHD gene in her laboratory also carries, in all probability, a blood type of one kind or another, and her work on the molecular mechanisms of the Rh blood group system is itself a form of attention to the ancient mystery, however different from the attention of the mythologist or the contemplative. She is asking the same questions that have always been asked about blood. What is in it? What does it carry? What does it mean? But she's asking them with tools that can reach into the interior of the cell and read the instructions written there. And the answers she's generating are genuinely new knowledge, genuinely illuminating aspects of the mystery that no previous form of inquiry has been able to approach. Between the Basque farmer and the molecular biologist, between the ancient mythology and the genetic sequencer, there is a space that is neither science nor myth, but something that partakes of both. The space of genuine inquiry into questions that matter, questions about identity and heritage, and the nature of what is carried in the blood from one generation to the next. That space is where this story has been living all along, and it is the space where the mystery of our negative blood is most honestly and most productively examined. The ancient world knew, in its own way, what the modern world is rediscovering through its genetics laboratories, that the blood is a record, that it carries within its molecular architecture a history that extends back through time in ways that the conscious mind cannot access, but that the tools of patient inquiry can begin to read. The ancient world read that record in the language of myth and ritual, encoding its observations in stories that were designed to be remembered and transmitted across the generations, embedding the knowledge in narrative forms that could survive the absence of writing and the disruption of institutions and the catastrophic losses of civilizational collapse. The modern world reads the same record in the language of molecular biology, encoding its observations in journal articles and databases and the sequence files that fill the hard drives of research institutions around the world. Both readings are partial. Both are attempts to describe something that is, in its full complexity, beyond the capacity of any single method or any single framework to completely capture. The myth reaches for meaning that the molecular biology cannot yet provide. The molecular biology establishes facts that the myth cannot produce. Between them, something like a complete account may eventually become possible, though it is not possible yet, and the pretense that it is possible yet, in either direction, the pretense of the mythologist that the ancient texts provide a complete explanation or the pretense of the reductionist that the molecular data makes the mythology irrelevant, is itself a form of the premature closure that the genuine mystery most needs to be protected from. The closing of the story of raw negative blood, if such a closing is ever to come, will require the patience to hold open the questions that remain open, and the honesty to acknowledge the limits of what is currently known. It will require the scientific community to take seriously the distributional data and its evolutionary puzzles, to investigate without prejudice the possible associations between blood type and neurological or psychological characteristics, and to follow the ancient DNA evidence wherever it leads without forcing it into a predetermined narrative. And it will require the popular and mythological traditions to maintain their genuine insights, the structural parallels between different cultures' divine bloodline narratives, the long observation of lineage and its effects on human capacity, while releasing the specific claims that the evidence does not support and that ultimately undermine the credibility of the genuine questions they are trying to ask. The smoke from the ceremonial fires of 100 ancient traditions rises together in the imagination, mingling above the flat horizon of the Mesopotamian plain, above the stepped summits of the Atlantic coast monuments, above the temple platforms of Egypt and India and Mesoamerica, into a single column that ascends into the darkening sky. The people who lit those fires understood something about the blood that the modern world is still learning to articulate. They understood that it carries a history, and that the history is long, and that the length of the history is itself a form of dignity that demands respect. They understood that certain lineages carry certain qualities, and that the recognition of those qualities is not merely a social convention, but a response to something real in the biological and experiential world. They understood that the mixing of different lineages produces something new, and that the new thing may carry qualities of both origins in ways that are not entirely predictable or entirely controllable, but that are real and significant and worthy of careful attention. Whether the R-negative blood type is the specific biological marker of the ancient divine bloodlines that so many cultures have described, whether it is the surviving trace of a prehistoric population whose genetic heritage was unusually rich in whatever qualities the ancient world associated with divine ancestry, whether it is simply an ancient deletion whose distribution reflects the demographic history of the Western, Eurasian populations and nothing more profound than that, these are questions that remain genuinely open. The honest answer is that we do not yet know. The honest answer is that the question is real, the data is partial, the interpretive frameworks are all incomplete, and the mystery has not been resolved. and in that unresolution, there is something that is not merely the frustration of ignorance, but the dignity of a genuine question. The mystery of our negative blood is a genuine question about human origins, about the nature of inheritance, about the relationship between the biological and the spiritual, about what the ancient world knew and how it knew it, and what of that knowledge remains available to us across the enormous distances of time that separate us from the people who first began to ask these questions in the smoke-filled interiors of their stone and mud brick houses, watching their children grow and noticing what the blood carried forward, and wondering, as we wonder now, what it all means. The night is almost complete. The ancient world has settled into its patient darkness, and the stars have made their slow turn across the sky, the same stars that watched over the ziggurat of Ur and the passage tomb of Newgrange, and the stone circles of the Basque Highlands, and the laboratory benches of Vienna where Karl Landsteiner first glimpsed the extraordinary complexity hidden in a single drop of human blood. The world outside is still, and the breath is slow, and the long story has been told as fully as it can be told with what is currently known. The blood moves through you now, in this quiet moment, with its own ancient rhythm, unhurried and steady, carrying whatever it carries from wherever it came. It has been moving this way for a very long time, through all the generations that connect you to the people whose stories have been told tonight, through all the seasons and migrations and catastrophes and quiet, ordinary days that make up the long fabric of the human story. It does not know that it is ancient. It does not know that it is being studied or wondered about or woven into theories of divine origin and cosmic significance. It simply moves, as it has always moved, doing what blood does, carrying life forward one beat at a time through whatever comes next. Let that rhythm settle into you now, as the story comes to rest. The fan turns in its slow circle, and the room is very quiet, and the ancient world and the modern world share the same darkness, without any division between them. The questions that have been asked tonight have been heard, and they rest now in the same patient space where all genuine questions rest, waiting for the answers that will come in their own time and in their own way, neither hurried nor forgotten. The stars above the Basque hills are reflected faintly in the surface of a high mountain lake that has no name in any modern map, because it has been there longer than the practice of naming, and the reflection is still and clear and very old. The shepherd who passed this lake this morning on his way to the high pasture has already made his way home, and the sheep are settled for the night, and the stone walls of the farmhouse hold the warmth of the day against the cooling mountain air, and somewhere inside that house a fire burns low, and the voices have gone quiet, and the night has taken up its proper work of rest. The blood rests too in its way, slowing its pace with the slowing of the sleeping body, carrying its ancient cargo through the quiet dark. Whatever it carries has been carried this way for a very long time, and it will be carried this way for a very long time to come, through children not yet born and ages not yet arrived, patient and faithful and entirely without anxiety about the mystery of its own nature. Rest now, and let the ancient world hold you, as it has always held everything that has ever lived within it, with the vast and quiet patience of something that has seen many ages come and go, and that knows, in whatever way ancient things can be said to know, that the rhythm continues, that the blood moves, that the mystery deepens rather than resolves, and that the deepening is itself a form of grace. The past rests in its long sleep, and tomorrow waits at the edge of the dark with its own steady light, and between the two, in this soft and quiet moment, you're held by something older than any question, and more patient than any answer. The simple fact of being alive and breathing and carrying in your blood the long thread of everything that came before. Sleep well. The mystery will still be here when the morning comes,